911, what's the address of your emergency? My friend called me, and he's like laying there with a bunch of blood. He's not breathing.
He's not breathing?
Oh my God, there's so much blood.
They find him laying on the ground. They quickly realize that this was a major crime that had occurred.
I was just trying to think of who it could have been that killed my brother.
We discovered that there were several cameras that showed in the last moments of the deceased's life.
And that's where leads started breaking for this case. Now we have a fugitive essentially on the run.
I have him on video at 3 different locations. The whole shooting is on video.
"20-year-old Gabriel Perez is on his way to hang out in the park with his sister and niece.
Hey, Lisa!
Hey!
Is that my favorite niece?
That's Uncle! Hi, Uncle! Whoa!
Gabriel was really goofy.
Hi! Hey!
Where's there?
That's my favorite niece, huh?
Just outgoing and loving with everyone, anyone and everyone. Just enjoying life, you know, going out, having parties.
Oh, you're having so much fun, aren't you?
He loved my daughter.
The kitty? What kitty?
He was the fun uncle as well.
Do you want to go higher, Bunny?
Gabriel was just really nurturing with her.
He always cared, like, if he saw you down in the dumps, he would say something really goofy to get you back up and going.
You're hanging with your skater buddies this weekend?
Yeah, actually, I'm gonna go to a party with Marianne.
The last time I saw Gabriel, we went to the park and we hung out.
Oh, Alpha.
If I would have known that that would have been the last time I actually seen Gabriel in person, I would have told him that I loved him.
What? I never would think, you know, something like this could happen.
I got a party to go to, but catch you guys later.
Bye. Take care.
What's the address of your emergency? My friend called me and said that he fell on the skateboard and he was at McDonald's on me. And I'm over here, and he's like laying there with a bunch of blood, and you know, his eyes are open. He's not breathing.
He's not breathing?
Oh my God, there's so much blood.
The paramedics are on the way there, okay?
I'm so scared.
A 911 call came in indicating that a male had been injured, that he's bleeding. And until officers arrived on scene, they discovered something much worse had happened. They find him laying on the ground by the sidewalk in front of McDonald's. The 911 caller was with him. They assessed his injuries. They quickly realized that this was a major crime that had occurred.
The injured person is Gabriel Perez.
First responding officers began life-saving efforts, but he was pronounced deceased at the scene. By the time I arrived on scene, officers had cordoned off the area. We see he's got multiple apparent gunshot wounds.
Mr. Perez was shot 3 times. One of the bullets went through his heart, and that's what killed him.
The first thing I wanted to do was speak with the 911 caller, who was identified as Marianne Delgado.
Detective Hansen, Detective Jonas.
Fargo PD. Let's talk inside.
She was the only person on scene that knows the victim in this case.
Where were you and Gabe earlier this morning?
We were at a party.
She explained that the two had met up and went to a house party in South Fargo.
Was there any trouble at this party?
I don't think so. I left around 1.
She went back to Moorhead, Minnesota, and left Gabriel Perez back at this house party. Perez starts sending her several messages, and Perez wants her to come back. He wants a ride.
He said, "Yo, where are you at?" I said, "Moorhead." He said, "Can you come pick me up?"
What time was that at?
4:24.
Gabriel Perez was sending multiple texts, increasing in urgency. Around 5 a.m., Gabriel Perez sends her his last message.
"Please come and get me. I fell so effing hard and I'm bleeding bad."
What time?
5:21.
When she got there, she found out what state he was in and called 911. I started assessing the scene. I did a walkthrough of it. We see evidence of a shooting. There's bullet impact marks in the sidewalk and in the concrete in the parking lot, on the facade of McDonald's. .145 caliber casing was found on scene. So one of the questions is, where are the other casings?
Get forensics, have them comb the area, see if there's any more casings.
Yeah. Gabriel Perez's cell phone was located near his body. We wanted to see if that had any location information to show his whereabouts leading up to his death.
Get a warrant for Gabe's cell phone. See who else he spoke to before he was shot.
Investigators give Gabe's family the news.
I got a call from my mom.
Hey, Mom.
And she was crying. She ended up blurting out that Gabriel's dead. I remember just dropping on the floor. I just couldn't process any of it.
I hear loud banging on my door. My dad comes in, and then he told me, and I'm like, Like, are you joking with me? Because it just didn't seem real.
My phone starts ringing. And it's my brother telling me, hey, they found Gabriel dead at McDonald's. Tears were running down my face. And it feels like my rib exploded. I can't even breathe.
There are no witnesses to the crime, so investigators pin their hopes on surveillance footage.
We quickly realized McDonald's had multiple cameras.
Okay, this one right here, this is gonna give us some good footage. We're gonna have this area covered.
It was very fortunate, in a sad way, that this shooting happened outside of McDonald's because there were several cameras pointed directly at the area of the shooting.
Excuse me, you the manager? I need to see your surveillance footage.
They have 2 cameras that covered the side of McDonald's where Gabriel Perez was shot. Camera 15 is pointing towards the south and the east, and that covers part of Main Avenue going towards the east of McDonald's.
Spin it from 5 a.m. Stop. That's him. Play that again.
We can see Gabriel Perez arrive at about 5:20 a.m.
Zoom in from there.
It's at about 5:21 a.m. You can see Gabriel appears to be using his cell phone.
That's when he texts Marianne Delgado.
He was messaging Miss Delgado to tell her to come pick him up, and had told her that he had slipped and fallen on his skateboard. From what you could see in the security footage, he looked uninjured.
We don't know if he did fall off his skateboard or if he was just trying to get Delgado to hurry up and get over to McDonald's. He then sits down on the curb. The next thing we see is a black SUV come flying into the parking lot.
The vehicle immediately approaches Perez, stops.
Gabriel Perez looks up to see who stopped abruptly right in front of him and immediately stands up and starts running to get away from this vehicle. We don't know why.
That kid looks scared.
The vehicle speeds out of the parking lot and then drives eastbound on Main Avenue.
We need a better look at that vehicle.
You have a camera facing the other way. Can we see that one?
The McDonald's restaurant had multiple cameras.
On this camera, Gabriel Perez sits down, just out of frame.
On the west-facing camera, we could see the vehicle enter the parking lot.
Stop. Play that again.
At 5:23 a.m., we could see the vehicle stop right in front of Gabriel Perez.
Zoom in.
The driver reaches across his body with his right hand. You can see a pistol in his hand. And he fires downward at Gabriel Perez. You can see the recoil from the gun as multiple shots are fired.
He's point blank shooting at the kid.
Perez runs away as far as he can before he collapses to the ground. The actions depicted in the McDonald's footage very clearly identified that the person who pulled that trigger was acting with an intent to kill.
Is that a white male?
Maybe black hair.
You could see that it was a man. You couldn't make out his features exactly, but you could tell that he was wearing some sort of gray shirt.
We really need to ID this vehicle.
Let's go back to the first angle.
Stop. Play that one more time.
We slowed it down, watched it several times, trying to identify what make and model that vehicle is.
That's a Chevy.
It appears to be a black Chevy Trailblazer. There was no license plate visible on the vehicle.
What's that on the rear windshield?
The video wasn't crystal clear, but we could see the vehicle had unique stickers that we keyed in on. There's one on the rear windshield. And there was also another sticker that stood out that was on the rear driver's side door. So we put a bolo out for law enforcement within the whole metro area to be on the lookout for this vehicle.
Next, investigators retrace Gabe's movements to find out what he was doing in the hours before his death.
Delgado told us that she picks up Gabriel Perez and they go to this house party with people that Delgado knew. So the next question was, did anything occur at this party that led to Gabriel Perez's death? Delgado said the people that were at the house party were a friend named Devin and Devin's boyfriend, Ryan. We speak with them.
Hey, this is Detective Hansen from Fargo PD.
What we learned from those interviews was that
You actually suck at this game.
Gabriel Perez showed up. He was hanging out with them. And at one point in the night, he receives some messages. And it seemed like it was possibly something concerning to Gabriel Perez, whatever conversation that he was having over his phone, but they didn't know who he was communicating with. Devin went to bed, and Gabe and Ryan were still up playing video games at the house. Eventually, Ryan went to bed while Gabe was still there. Next day, they wake up, and Gabriel was no longer there.
Okay.
No one really knew where Gabe was going when he left that night. He just left.
We wanted to know, who was Gabriel talking to? What would be concerning in his life? Why did Gabriel go to McDonald's at that time in the early morning hours? We wanted to establish not only his timeline of when he left that house party, but the specific route he took to get to McDonald's. We have a vehicle identified as a suspect vehicle. Is Gabriel Perez being followed by this vehicle along those routes? So it was important for us to find any and all video of Gabriel Perez's route. We looked at surveillance video from a traffic cam on 13th Avenue and South University Drive.
Spool it from 4 a.m.
Sometime after 4 a.m., Gabriel Perez was sending multiple texts telling Delgado he needs a ride. He arrived at McDonald's at 5:20 a.m., so that's the time frame we want to grab this video from.
Look.
That's him.
The traffic cam at University and 13th Avenue showed Gabriel skateboarding at 5:09 a.m.
We could see in that video that Gabe was traveling alone, and he was traveling north.
It's pretty much just him on the street by himself. Watching this video of Gabriel Perez en route to McDonald's, nothing stood out as concerning.
So at that point, the suspect vehicle was still at large, and we had no identified person associated with the shooting.
Across the state line in Moorhead, Minnesota, Gabriel's family is in shock following his murder.
It's heart-shattering, you know? Like, you don't know what to do in that situation. What can you do?
Police can only do so much, but we wanted more to be done. We wanted to know who it was.
Gabe's family was very upset about what had happened, and they took it upon themselves to start solving the crime.
In Gabe's bedroom, the family finds a crucial piece of evidence.
My brother calls and says, hey, I found a phone number. It's not gonna get you nowhere is what I told my brother. It's probably nothing. But he proceeded it and called it anyway.
Hello?
Hello? This is Gabriel Perez's uncle?
There's a frantic woman on the other side of the line, and she just starts bawling, saying, Gabriel's did because of me. It's my fault he's gone.
Hold on. It's okay. Stay on the line.
He's trying to calm her down, try to get more information.
I want to help you.
Then she hangs up. At that point, I'm shocked, and like I told him, if it's a Minnesota number, a Moorhead number, she has to live close.
Yeah. Approximately 6:40 p.m., we receive a phone call from the uncles of Gabriel Perez.
And what did she say?
They spoke with a female. This female implied that she had knowledge that Gabriel Perez was dead. She was expressing guilt over his death.
She didn't identify herself at that point.
What was that number?
But we knew this number connects to somebody that's going to get us directly to the killer.
Run this.
So we have that phone number ran through the Fargo police records.
Okay, thank you. Any hits?
Looks to be a VO number.
Turns out that that phone number was actually a voice over IP number ran by a company called Text Now.
I'm gonna call the DA and we're gonna get a subpoena.
So I submitted an emergency disclosure to Text Now to identify who this woman is.
Just 20 minutes later, investigators received news of another potential breakthrough in the case.
Moorhead police called us and said they located a black SUV that appears to be a black Chevy Trailblazer. So this case is now moving at an extremely fast pace.
The vehicle itself matched the broad description of what was seen on the McDonald's video.
This vehicle was parked in an apartment complex. Black Chevy Trailblazer, no license plate.
There was a sticker on the back of the vehicle which had been partially peeled off.
That sticker that we could see on the surveillance video from McDonald's had been removed. However, they did a poor job at removing it. It was apparent it was the same vehicle.
Well, what do we got here?
There's actually a fired cartridge casing on the outside of the front windshield, right by the windshield wipers. And it's a .45 caliber casing, consistent with the one we found at the scene. My thoughts are, what are the odds? We then obtained a search warrant and subsequently searched the vehicle. One of the things that was found is a receipt.
See that?
And it's an ATM withdrawal receipt.
From Vision Bank in Fargo, we could see that there was a time and a date stamp. September 22nd at 9:04 p.m. The night that Gabe was killed.
So my next step is I went to Vision Bank and obtained a subpoena requesting that they provide me with any surveillance video the bank has to see who was withdrawing that money at that time.
While investigators wait for the ATM footage, they receive a report on the number that was found in Gabe's bedroom.
Hey, I got a name to match that number.
Shortly after midnight, TextNow gets back to us. I start looking through TextNow's data, which identifies the subscriber as Izetta Cooley.
Detectives run a background check on Izetta. She's a 39-year-old mother of 7.
Izetta Cooley and her husband have multiple children together. They reside in Moorhead. Now we have a big decision on our hands. How do we try to reach out to Izetta in a way that's not going to precipitate further violence? What we decide is we can't risk reaching out until we knew more information.
Why don't you pull up her social media?
Initially, we didn't see any direct link to Gabriel Perez. He's like 20 years old at the time, closer to the age of Izetta Cooley's oldest children.
Investigators analyze Gabriel's Facebook records.
I saw on September 20th, he friended Izetta Cooley. And we can see some Facebook messages between Izetta and Gabriel Perez. Looking through those messages, initially, Izetta sent Gabriel messages saying she was looking for her daughter, and quickly, Gabriel Perez turns a message to Izetta saying how he thinks Izetta was attractive. And that appeared to spark conversations back and forth that read pretty flirtatious between the two of them.
Through the course of the next several days, Izetta and Gabe keep talking.
On September 21st, Gabriel seemed to initiate trying to coordinate a time to meet, that the two were going to be romantic with each other. And then a few hours before the murder, the messages drastically change. Izetta's messages about meeting up with Gabriel appeared to be increasing in urgency.
Izetta reached out to Gabe to set up a meetup, at the McDonald's restaurant that morning.
She's setting up the meet.
Within minutes of him arriving, Gabe reaches out to Izetta and tells her, "I'm here at the McDonald's."
2 minutes after Gabriel sends the message, the driver of the SUV shoots him dead.
The next step was figuring out who it was that was driving that Trailblazer and who pulled the trigger.
Investigators received the surveillance footage from the ATM at Vision Bank.
The receipt showed the withdrawal of the ATM on September 22nd at 9:04. So I wanted to see who was operating the vehicle at that time. And I start looking at that video. I see a black SUV appearing to be a black Chevy Trailblazer. It pulls right up to the ATM. And that's where you get a good look of the driver withdrawing cash.
Stop.
You can see the stickers in the vehicle that matched the McDonald's video.
I'm gonna rewind this.
Most notably, you can see who's driving. He's dressed in the same clothing that the shooter appeared to be wearing in the McDonald's video.
Here's our shooter.
He's getting that receipt.
That was a pretty big moment in the investigation, but now we needed to identify the driver. When we found the vehicle, there was no license plate, but the vehicle has a vehicle identification number or VIN number. We ran the VIN number of that vehicle, and the VIN number came back to Izetta Cooley.
Check for everyone who lives at that residence.
We start running backgrounds on them to figure out as much as we can. Izetta Cooley was married to Miguel Cooley Sr.
Investigators pull up Miguel's license. The photo is a match for the driver in the ATM footage.
There's no doubt it was Miguel Cooley Sr. driving that vehicle. We've now got a suspect identified. So now we have to go apprehend him. We obtain a search warrant for Miguel Cooley's residence.
Fargo PD, we have a warrant to search your property.
Izetta's home. She was somewhat cooperative, but, kind of standoffish a little bit. She says that Miguel Cooley is not at home. If we don't find Miguel Cooley there himself, the evidence we're looking for is any firearms, particularly a pistol. We found a lot of ammunition, some of it .45 caliber, consistent with what we found at the crime scene. We also come across 3 sets of Chevy keys. That's a significant piece of evidence. Those keys link that vehicle to that residence.
That solidified the connection between Miguel Cooley and this crime.
We request that Izetta turn over her cell phone.
Investigators take Izetta to the police department for questioning.
You do have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can only be used against you in a court of law.
She's interviewed by law enforcement. I remember that being a very bizarre interview.
You can't do this. I'm barely keeping it together as it is, man. I can't even breathe. I can't even breathe.
Izetta was not the most cooperative during the interview. She was very vague on a lot of things. I asked her if she was engaging with some sort of romantic relationship with Gabriel Perez.
There was no relationship.
Why did you want to meet with him? His messages read like you two are flirting.
I wasn't having a relationship.
So you were just toying around with him? Or just flirting kind of for fun? Well, then what does it mean?
Izetta Cooley also was maintaining her husband's innocence.
No, I think you're here to incriminate my husband.
I don't know that we can incriminate him more than he's incriminated the whole shooting on video.
You guys don't understand. It's not, I'm not talking to you anymore.
Try me.
I'm done.
At the time we're interviewing Izetta, we received a phone call. Authorities in Minnesota have tracked down Miguel Cooley. Miguel Cooley is ultimately located in the Rochester, Minnesota area at his sister and brother-in-law's home. The U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force were brought in to apprehend Miguel Cooley.
Miguel, give yourself up! Show me your hands! Walk towards me with your hands up!
Miguel Cooley has changed his appearance. He's shaved off his beard.
Stop right there! Turn around. Place your hands behind your back.
The task force arrests Miguel Cooley for the murder of Gabriel Perez.
That was a really big relief for me and my family. It's one step closer to getting Gabriel justice.
I was definitely glad that he got found. But at the same time, it's just like I didn't want to accept the fact that Gabriel was gone. So you know what I mean? I just felt so lost on it.
Miguel Cooley is transferred to the Mower County Jail. Myself and 3 other detectives start conducting interviews. We're trying to narrow down exactly why this occurred. And I was curious as to whether or not Miguel Cooley would tell us anything about why he killed Gabriel Perez.
We're here to talk with you about what's been going on the last few days. Yeah, everything's like blurred.
What pissed you off and got you to the point that Sunday morning happened?
No, I was pretty drunk. I went to Austin.
Austin, Minnesota?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I went there and wanted to get some tires, but they didn't have any tires at the Walmart there.
All he told us was everything was a blur. He wanted to talk about having a flat tire, so very nondescript, nothing that would rule him out.
He said I have a defense attorney, someone told me how to get one.
He requested his attorney, so we never spoke any further than that. It can be a little frustrating at times when people don't want to talk, but I mean, that's their right. Around this time, we're able to get into the cell phone data from Izetta's phone.
We can access her texts.
We wanted to know if Izetta was complicit in any way. I see that there's a text message a few hours after the murder. Izetta sent a message to someone close to her. She mentioned that prior to the murder, Miguel ended up going to a restaurant called the Frying Pan to get food.
Investigators head to the restaurant to analyze the surveillance footage for clues.
We don't know exactly when he was at the Frying Pan, but we could start with working back from when he was at McDonald's.
Can you show us 5 a.m. on September 23rd?
Sure enough, Miguel Cooley entered the restaurant at about 5:09 a.m.
The Frying Pan restaurant is within blocks of the McDonald's where Gabe Perez was shot and killed. So the question was, how did Miguel Cooley know that Gabe Perez would be in that McDonald's parking lot? Just minutes later.
Cooley looks like he's ordered food or is waiting for an order.
In the video from the frying pan, you can see Mr. Cooley's wearing the same shirt that he appears to be wearing on both the Vision Bank footage and the McDonald's footage.
Oh, he's really busy on his phone.
So he's within the area of the crime and communicating with someone in the moments before.
We know on the day of the murder, Izetta and Gabriel are exchanging messages. Izetta appears to be asking to meet with Gabriel Perez at the McDonald's. The frying pan video showed Miguel Cooley exiting the business at about 5:16 a.m. Gabriel Perez's last message to Izetta Cooley is at 5:21 a.m. And it just says that he's there at McDonald's. And within minutes, Miguel Cooley Sr. drives up and essentially executes him.
Detectives take a closer look at the Facebook messages between Izetta and Gabriel.
One of Izetta's messages, she describes what she's going to be wearing, a white t-shirt and gray pants. That message sounds a little suspicious. Gabriel and Izetta know each other. So if you're going to meet up, why do you need to know what they're wearing? But the messages arranging to meet at McDonald's may not have been submitted by Izetta. That was possibly Miguel Cooley Sr. sending those messages from her account. It's starting to make sense. He's luring Gabriel Perez to McDonald's with the intent to kill him.
The person Gabe believed was Izetta Cooley told him to meet her at the McDonald's. The person he met there was clearly not Izetta Cooley. Miguel Cooley could have sent the messages which led Gabe to go to that location. Miguel Cooley baited Gabe Perez to enter that parking lot. Based upon all the evidence collected in this case, we were able to charge Miguel with murder.
On August 22, 2019, Miguel Cooley appears in court and pleads guilty to first-degree murder. At Cooley's sentencing, prosecutors stepped through the events that led to Gabriel's death.
The evidence really showed that Gabriel Perez was engaging in flirtatious texts with Miguel Cooley's wife.
Gabe and Izetta were apparently communicating through Facebook Messenger. Mr. Cooley was aware of these messages, and that's what fueled him in his rage.
You actually suck at this game. What the?
Gabriel and Izetta arranged to meet at McDonald's. Gabriel was directed to go there from Izetta's Facebook account. But I believe Miguel Cooley probably took over her account.
Mr. Cooley knew Gabe Perez would be outside the McDonald's. When Mr. Cooley entered that McDonald's parking lot, he moved with clear intent. He drove directly towards Gabe Perez, stopped, shot him, and left within seconds. He had one reason for being there, and that was to kill Gabe Perez.
On January 13, 2020, Miguel Cooley is sentenced to 50 years in prison. Izetta Cooley is charged with no crime in relation to Gabriel's murder. There is no evidence that she had any involvement in what happened.
Law enforcement did an exceptional job investigating this case. And part of that was recovering all of the security footage. It was critical for us to prove our charge of murder.
I don't think we'll ever come to terms with losing Gabriel. Losing somebody in general is painful, but losing somebody in the way we lost Gabriel is worse.
Gabriel was one of the most caring people that I knew and that I've ever came across in my life.
Gabriel was close to turning 21, and we're only a year apart, so we were just really close. Not just my brother, but like my friend. I could still like hear his voice, him asking how I am, how loving he was. That's what I miss most about him.
This season on See No Evil.
Kansas City 911. You'll come, please. Someone got stuck.
This is a personal thing.
I shot him and then said, "Remember me, bitch."
We start to look for possible surveillance cameras. If they go inside, we will have them at that point.
There was a strong odor. I have only ever been able to associate it with death.
It is suspicious. What are they doing with this money?
Oh my God, there's so much blood.
I was just trying to think of who it could have been that killed my brother.
He's luring the victim to McDonald's with the intent to kill him.
The whole shooting's on video.
You had to pull a gun and shoot my brother over a girl?
This was actually a planned out execution.
I believe I've seen a dead person.
He was living a double, if not a triple life.
We got you on video. We've got you on video.
The night the city held its breath was hot and unreasonably still, the kind of heat that makes you hear your own pulse like a drum in your ears, the kind of heat that glues the smell of salt and gasoline to your skin and makes every streetlight smear like melted glass across Avenida Atlantica. And if you ask anyone who was there, they will tell you they remember the sound first, not a scream, not a gunshot, just the small, delicate crack of something fragile giving way, as if a secret decided to slip loose and vanish into the water, because in Rio, secrets go to the ocean when they're too heavy for the hills to carry. And on that Sunday in November 2001, a young woman named Livia walked out of a beach bar in Copacabana wearing a red dress and white sandals and did not walk back into any place that could be found. And for 24 years, the city called it a cold case, and the family called it a wound that wouldn't clot, and the police called it a file they could not close because every time they tried to turn the last page, another unanswered question scratched at their hands like glass hidden in paper, a small cut that stung and kept stinging. And so the legend grew, the way legends always grow here, mixed with gossip and sweat and the hiss of bus brakes and the late-night whisper of radios in apartments with open windows. And when the anonymous podcast finally dropped a new episode last month, the one with no host name and no ad breaks and no intro music, just the low, intimate voice that sounded close enough to breathe on your neck, the episode that said we need to talk about Livia in the red dress, that was when the old fear woke up like a stray dog lifting its head at the smell of rain, and the city listened. Because Rio knows a performance when it hears one, and this voice gave you the truth like contraband slid into your palm. She left the bar at 1:12 a.m. The camera said, though the tape was a copy of a copy, and the timestamp glitched every 3 seconds, and a bartender remembered an unfinished caipirinha sweating onto a coaster shaped like a postcard, and the doorman remembered a taxi idling, yellow paint gone dull under the sodium lamps, and a guitarist in the corner remembered stopping mid-song because a string snapped and cut his finger and blood dotted the tile like punctuation marks on an angry sentence. And in the space between those facts there was a silence that stretched like a bridge. No one wanted to cross. So the investigation pushed forward and then slipped back, pushed forward and then sank, like tide, like breath, like the city itself. And the detectives who took the case spoke of the long corridor of years where every lead felt like fluorescent light, bright, humming, slightly sickening, never warm, until the light cut out and left them blinking in a hallway of closed doors. The city moved on the way cities do, fast and forgetful on the surface, faithful and haunted underneath. And Livia's mother kept a chair at the table for Christmas, and a candle by the kitchen window, and a radio at low volume all night because the announcers kept talking long after the music stopped. And if her daughter came home by mistake and needed a voice to follow, there it would be, steady as a lighthouse, the anonymous voices of the city holding hands with a woman who refused to let go. Years layered over years. Carnival floats rolled, stadiums roared, new towers speared the sky, presidents changed. The tram rattled past Santa Teresa walls painted with new murals over old grief. And still the red dress moved like a heat shimmer at the edge of memory, never quite resolving, only reminding. A headline without a body, a photograph without a timestamp, a rumor that learned to pronounce itself like fact. The official story sketched itself the way official stories do. Last seen at the curb, phone last pinged near a cluster of antennas uphill, an ex-boyfriend interviewed and eliminated, a taxi company that gave a partial plate and a shrug, and a beach that looked the same the next morning. Indifferent and glittering and loud, gulls arguing, waves shattering, sun pretending it had not seen anything, and forensics pulled hair from a brush and fibers from the dress and prints from a glass, and all it gave them was statistics that sounded like hope until you looked closely and saw they were just math dressed as mercy. A rumor said she got into a taxi that wasn't a taxi. A rumor said she walked to the bus stop to save money. A rumor said a black car ate her alive and spit out nothing. A rumor said she ran because she wanted to, because the city can be a cage when you're 22 and beautiful and tired of being watched. But rumors are the smoke alarm of a place that is always burning. And in the smoke it is easy to lose the shape of the fire. Enter the anonymous podcast born out of late-night audio sessions and a voice that did not apologize. A voice that cut sentences down to the bone and stacked them like dominoes, ticking forward, relentless, tabloid energy with a strange tenderness under the skin, the kind of tenderness that makes you lean closer instead of pushing away. No ads, no credits, no handle to grab, just a black cover image with a red waveform and a title that looked like a headline ripped from a wall. Rio, red dress, cold case, who saw her last? And this voice began in the second person, speaking not to the audience, but to Livia, as if she were still out there, as if the city could talk back to its ghosts, telling her what the tape showed and what the bartender swore and what the street remembered and what the water forgot, filling the room where you listened with the ache of almost. The city listened at kitchen tables and in Ubers and night shifts and on balconies, in apartments where the fan blades dragged the heat into slow circles. And the voice did something the files never did. It turned the camera around, asked who benefits from a ghost, asked who profits from a legend that never lands, asked what it means that we say cold case like we are putting a lid on something and then warming our hands over it for decades. In episode 2, the voice went to the hill and walked the path from the beach to the radios and pointed out the blind corners, the broken lamps, the favorite stoops, the little stores that change hands but never change air. And in episode 3, it spoke to a taxi dispatcher who said, after a long silence, that the partial plate gave him 3 possible cars, and only one of those drivers quit that same week and moved to a city north of here and never filed a forwarding address. And the voice did not say the driver's name, but it did say the street where he lived, and the street had neighbors with long memories. And neighbors have a way of finding their way to microphones when they think the microphone belongs to them. A woman said the driver had a wife who cried without sound, and a daughter who stopped wearing red, and one night he took a hammer to his own trunk latch because it kept sticking, and he said it was just age, just rust, just the car trying to tell him it was tired. And the podcast let the silence after that sentence stretch so long you could hear your own heart in it. And then it played a sound clip, not a confession, not yet, but the intimate soft clack of a trunk closing and a man testing it, up, down, and somewhere in that metronome the city found a rhythm it recognized, the rhythm of almost answers arriving out of the blue and lifting tiny hairs on your arm. Police reopened the file because they are not immune to heat, and the press rediscovered words like shocking twist and new lead and chilling detail, and Livia's mother lowered the radio volume and said nothing because hope is heavy, and she had carried enough of it, and the driver, let's call him Joao because the city is full of Joaos and each one is both innocent and terrified of being mistaken, lived quiet in a town whose bus station smells like diesel and rain, and his routine was a circle so small it fit in the palm of your hand. And when the podcast put his former street on the map, his phone lit up with old numbers he had not stored and new numbers he could not place. And someone slipped an audio file into his messages, 2 minutes and 18 seconds long. And when he played it, there was that voice, the anonymous one saying, "We are building a timeline, and if you want to correct it, this is your moment." Think of all the fathers who walked their daughters to school for 24 years because they were afraid of the red dress. Think of all the taxi trunks that slam and scare a city awake. Think of how absence becomes a habit and how we are all tired of the habit, and something in him moved like a fish too long in a small bowl, finally bumping its head against glass and understanding the shape of its life. And he went to the small station, the one with a chipped badge on the wall and a calendar that still had last month's picture, and he said, "I want to talk." and the officer, who had been listening to the same episodes on his phone with the volume low, looked at him and saw a man who had kept one story pressed flat under a book for 24 years and finally lifted the cover. Confession is not poetry, but it felt like a poem because the city had been waiting for a line that rhymed, something that tied the ocean to the sidewalk, the bar to the hill, the trunk to the night. He spoke in circles and then in shorter circles and then in a point, a pin pushed into a map that everyone had drawn 1,000 times. And he said he picked her up near the bar, that she was angry at someone on the phone, that she gave an address but wanted to change it halfway, that he missed a turn because a bus shouldered him, that she laughed once in the back like she was coughing out a word she didn't want to say, that the latch stuck when he pulled over to fix it and he remembered the hammer in the trunk and the jack in the roadside and the silence and all the small cheap reasons that add up to a life ending in the corner of a frame. And he said it wasn't supposed to happen, and he said he didn't know what to do, and he said he made a choice that ate the rest of his choices. And the city, listening through the leaked snippet of the station recording that arrived on the podcast feed like a storm blowing in through a cracked window, felt shock first and then something dirtier and more honest. The feeling of complicity that comes when you realize you held the story in your mouth the whole time, the way a crowd holds breath without meaning to, the way a rumor becomes shelter. It was not a perfect confession, it was a human one. Full of wrong turns and foggy edges and the low, wet sound of regret trying to stand up, and the detectives took it apart and put it back together and matched it to old measurements and old stains and a new angle on a bruise in a photograph no one had looked at in years, because sometimes you need a voice to point and say, look again. And then they found what the ocean had not taken and what time had not erased. Fibers in the trunk carpet that spoke red even when they looked brown, a trace under a gasket that said her name without letters, and the file stopped humming and started to sing, low and terrible and true. And yet even here, with a confession on tape and a street pointed out and a mother who finally moved the candle away from the window because the lighthouse had done its job, there was no neat bow, no clean chalk line around the facts, because a solved cold case is not a resurrection, it is a reckoning, and the city does not clap. It exhales, it shakes its head, it updates the story it tells itself while the buses hiss and the gulls argue and the heat drags itself over the asphalt. And somewhere a guitarist changes his string and tries the chord again, and somewhere a bartender puts out a coaster, and somewhere the ocean takes the small, delicate crack of a secret giving way and folds it into the general roar. And you listen to the last seconds of the episode where the anonymous voice goes quiet and lets you hear only the room tone, the breath, the waiting. Because even in a solved story, there is a residue you cannot scrub off, a bruise of maybe on the city's thigh. And this is where we begin. At the end that feels like a beginning, with a confession built out of air and a timeline built out of stubborn love, with a headline that finally reads, solved, in a community that knows better, that knows those 4 letters are an echo and an ache, that knows the red dress still walks, not because the dead walk, but because memory does, under this heat, under these lamps, under this sky that pretends not to see and sees everything. They called it the week the walls started talking because every surface in the city seemed to give back an echo. Stairwells, bus shelters, the tiled corridors of the metro, all carrying that low voice from the anonymous podcast and the clipped replies from the police pressers and the rustle of reporters digging in desk drawers for old notebooks that still smelled like salt. And what those walls said was simple and terrible, that the Rio 2001 cold case was moving, not solved, not clean, but moving, and movement makes people reckless and brave, so tips poured in and lies followed right behind them. Glamour around grief like tinsel that snags and cuts, and in that noise the voice kept threading a line, a thin red piece of string that ran from the bar to the taxi stand, to the hill, and into the small town where Joao tried to become nobody, and the string did not slacken. Detectives asked for the car. The car was gone, sold years ago for parts, but some parts still existed because nothing ever fully disappears when it is drenched in a story, and in a breaker yard half drowned in weeds, they found a trunk lid with a dent in the edge where a latch had been stubborn and a hammer had taught it manners. And maybe it was not the lid from that car, but maybe is a word that makes evidence lean forward and listen. So they took it in and looked for the ghost of fibers, for a red that still whispered after decades of sun. And while they did that, the podcast doorbell chimed again and again with messages, some cruel, some crazed, some tender, and one that made the voice stop talking for almost a full breath before the recording resumed. Because this one came from a woman who said she remembered being on the bus that shouldered the taxi that night, and she remembered the back seat and the small movement of a hand against the window, And she remembered it because the hand drew a fog heart on the glass and then wiped it away when the driver looked, and she remembered it because the gesture was fierce and disciplined, like a soldier erasing a trace. And in that erased heart, the voice found a new way to tell the story, a new image to hang the air on. Not a scream, not a struggle, but a private gesture that contradicts the neatness of fear. The family did not want cameras, but cameras wanted the family, and in the economy of grief, that is the cruelest exchange, and Livia's mother stayed inside, guarding the kitchen chair that had become a talisman, while her brother went to the building entrance and said into a hedge of microphones that he would listen to the station tape once, only once, and after that he would not comment, because he was not a headline and he was not a witness, and he was tired of being asked to play both roles at once, and his voice was steady at first, and then not steady. And you could hear the city lean toward the television as if proximity could be comfort, as if pressing your ear to the glass could make the cold case less cold. The station leaked only what the anonymous podcast already had, a few minutes of a man working his way toward a confession like a diver surfacing too slow to avoid the bends. And the voice did not gloat and did not point fingers, it just said, listen to the rhythm of it, how he circles the night and keeps catching on the same hook, the stuck latch, the bus, the sharp laugh in the back seat, the choice that ate all the other choices. And the detectives listened too and circled the same hooks, and then they did what paper cannot do alone. They went back to the street at the same hour and stood in the same places and watched the light and the gaps in the light, and they timed a bus and they measured a taxi turn, and they found a camera that no one had listed in 2001 because it did not belong to a shop. It belonged to a kiosk that only ran in summer and had been closed the week after Livia vanished. But the owner kept a habit of saving every machine he ever bought, and the old DVR still lived in a box under a bed with 3 dead remotes and a nest of cables. And when the detectives lifted the recorder into the weak light of the room, it looked like a little coffin for a lost dog. And when they turned it on, it hummed once and then again and then stopped. And then a technician with hands like a clockmaker shrugged and said, "Give me time and a bag of patience, and maybe, just maybe, I can get you ghosts." And the podcast told that detail, and the city loved it, because we all want the past to be resurrected by a man with careful hands and a stubborn heart. The ex-boyfriend did an interview he should not have done. Shoulders square, jaw set, trying to look like a man who had loved and lost, and not like a man who had once been young and jealous and careless with words. And he said he had nothing to hide, and he held his palms up like a saint. And the interviewer asked about the argument on the phone that Joao mentioned, and the ex-boyfriend's pupils did a small weather change, bright to dark to bright, and the city took a screenshot and texted it to itself like a talisman. Look, the eyes do not lie, but eyes lie as easily as mouths do. And the detectives saw posture and not pupils. They saw timestamps, they saw billing logs, they saw that the call came from a number that belonged to a friend who had become not a friend, the kind of number you delete, but your phone remembers anyway. A small technological betrayal. And that friend, when found, said he had drunk too much and said too much and wanted to take it all back. And the detective said life does not allow returns on this kind of purchase. And the podcast let the words sit, heavy and unadorned. Science tried to help. The tide table from that night, the wind speed, the current maps, the drift models, the way a body would move if it entered the water at this angle or that. A story told by numbers that pretended to be indifferent and were not. And the pathologist who had retired in 2015 came back for coffee and a look at the files and said softly that absence is not proof, and that statistics are a choir that can be made to sing any hymn if you press them hard enough. And everyone nodded like they understood and then went back to pressing, because this is what cold case work looks like, the slow arms race between doubt and desire. The car parts yielded less than a courtroom would like, but more than a storyteller needs. And the trunk lid told the truth of a hammer and nothing else, and carpet fibers dissolved into the general dust of a city that rides on its own skin flakes and hair and lint, and so they built something instead, out of habit and rote, mapped years of fares, traced the driveways where Joao would finger the latch like a worry bead, found 3 other nights where a passenger reported a sudden stop to fix something in the trunk, and 2 where the passenger said they got out at the curb to stretch their legs and breathe air that tasted like iron and fear. And none of that was a body, but all of it was a shape of a pattern, and patterns are what juries recognize even when they swear to see only facts. The anonymous voice kept cutting sentences to the bone, kept saying, "You remember because it is your memory too, because the city is a single organism with an attention span and a nervous system and a way of holding a bruise for decades without letting it fade." And the show started using a metronome again, that up, down of the trunk sound stitched into the background so quietly you did not notice unless you were listening for the hammer. And people argued in comments about whether that was manipulative or perfect. And the voice did not reply because it did not need to. It had already put the listener in the car. Meanwhile, a rumor bloomed that the voice belonged to someone who had known Livia, a classmate, a neighbor, someone from the block where kids learned to ride bikes in a pack and later learned to leave in a pack for safety. And this rumor mattered because if it were true, the voice was speaking from inside the house and not from the street. And inside voices carry a different weight, and the voice played with that, letting small details slip now and then. A childhood snack brand, the exact pitch of a school bell, the nickname of a stray dog, breadcrumb intimacy that both invited and deflected, and the family hated it and needed it. And that is how grief feeds itself when a cold case finally warms. The confession did not erase the question you could feel in the bones of the city, the why that never fits any set of answers. Because why is a myth that promises justice and delivers only explanation. An explanation is a dull spoon against the iron of loss. And the detectives knew that, and still, they worked like people who believe in spoons, filing, cross-checking, drawing new lines in red pencil on a photocopied map that had been folded so many times it was as soft as fabric. And they brought in a young analyst who had been 7 when Livia disappeared, and who had grown up with the case as bedtime cautionary tale. And she sat with the audio and marked the rests like a music student, noting where fear breathed, where guilt inhaled. And she built a cadence model that suggested which words were rehearsed and which fell out of the mouth on their own. And the rehearsed parts hugged the edges of the story, and the falling parts spiked in the center where the trunk stuck and the bus elbowed and the hammer knocked the latch free like knuckles on a door that should have been locked. And this was not evidence, but it was conviction fuel, and the city drank it like coffee. A small thing moved the needle. A calendar page from the kiosk box flaked away from the DVR, and on the back was a list of cash transfers done by hand when the machine failed, and one of the names matched the old dispatcher for the taxi company. And that dispatcher was dying, and that dispatcher wanted to hold on to his best and worst memories like birds in his sleeves. And he said that on that night he had told a driver to run the hill instead of the tunnel, and he said he remembered the plate because it had a pair of numbers that made a face if you looked sideways. And he said the driver called back after a scrape and said he would file damage later. And his voice cracked on later, that small word that invites the future and then chokes on it. And the podcast played his voice and let the crack sit like a pebble in the throat of the city. And when the episode ended, no one moved for a breath. Kitchens paused. Ubers idled at green lights. Balconies held their laundry still. They brought Joao back in, not in cuffs yet, not in chains, not in anything that would satisfy a camera. Just a tired man in a chair under fluorescent light, and they asked him about later, and he said the word without knowing it was a test. And when he reached for water, the plastic cup betrayed a tremor that did not match his voice, and the analyst circled it with a pen only she could see. And outside the station a handful of candles bloomed, small flames that waved like eager hands in a classroom, and around them people began to craft their own endings. Because that is what we do when a cold case walks toward heat. We push it with our breath. We draft conclusions as if they are invitations we can send to the past. Please attend. Dress code formal. Bring closure if available. But closure is an export product the city rarely manufactures, and the ocean is a thief that never returns what it takes in the same shape, and still the headline shimmered like a promise. Rio 2001 cold case solved. Not entirely true yet, and already true in the way that matters to crowds. Because confession had made a path through the fog, and the voice had made that path feel like a street we all knew. And the strange hush that falls before a parade fell across the blocks around the station. And the guitarist in the bar tuned the string that had once snapped and cut him, and tried not to look at the empty corner near the door. And the bartender put a fresh coaster out like a held breath, and the mother in the kitchen turned the radio up and then down and then up again, as if she could set the volume to a number that equals a daughter. They brought the hill back to life on a Wednesday at 1:00 a.m., because the body of the story insists on being measured at the hour it broke, and the team moved like ghosts under busted lamps and soft moth light, tape on curbs, cones at corners, chalk X's where witnesses had stood in 2001, and where they might have stood if memory was a faithful animal. And nothing about memory is faithful, but the ritual mattered, the reconstruction mattered, because this is how you make a cold case breathe. You give it air, you give it angles, you give it the night back and ask the night to tell you what it hid. A bus shouldered the narrow curve exactly as the old dispatcher had described. A long steel sigh with paint too bright for the hour, and the loaner taxi took the turn too sharp on purpose, and the trunk latch stuck because they wanted it to, because a technician patted the catch with tape until it bit like the mouth of a sleeping dog, and one officer played the driver, and one officer sat in the back and laughed once, a single scrape of sound that felt like a cough in a dare. And they wrote time codes on clipboards while the city yawned and 2 dogs argued and a drunk sang the chorus to a song he only knew as noise. And somewhere a window opened and someone watched and texted a friend. They are making the case walk again. Back at the station, the DVR box gave up a heartbeat, not video, not clean, but a scan line that flickered like a pulse on a throat, and the technician frowned in a way that meant hope without promises. And the anonymous podcast told the city to hold its breath, not in a dramatic way, not with thunder, only with patience. That word no one in this town enjoys, and yet we obeyed because the voice had earned obedience. João slept badly. He dreamed of the trunk as a mouth that would not close and then as a mouth that would not open, and in the dream both were a crime, and neither felt like mercy. And when he woke, he put coffee in his hands like a shield and told himself he was a man who had already performed the hardest act a coward can perform, the act of speaking, and that the next acts would be easier because the city would take the story away now, would shoulder it like a bus shoulders a taxi, would let him become small in the swirl, but smallness did not arrive. And the phone rang with unknown numbers, and the door felt thin, and the morning news used his silhouette like a scarecrow to guard a field of rumors. The anonymous voice changed temperature. You could hear it if you were listening from the beginning. Less velvet, more iron. It began to cut at the myth that always grows around disappearances, the myth that violence requires monsters, the myth that victims choose a path that draws monsters close, the myth that the ocean cleans, the myth that time forgives. And it did this with clinical points you could balance on your fingernail, a detail here, a call record there, the way a red dress shows up in 2 photos 4 weeks apart, the way a friend borrowed the dress 3 nights before and returned it with a snag up near the rib cage, the way the snag could have been a chair or a key or a hand, and no one knows and everyone suspects, and suspicion is glue when a city wants to stick a narrative together. Livia returned in the telling, not as an icon, not as a cautionary poster silhouette, but as a person with a way of carrying anger like a secret jewel. A person who remembered birthdays and forgot to charge her phone. A person who worked late when the boss asked because she liked the quiet of the empty floor and the sound of the cleaning crew's radio. A person, not a theme, not a headline. And that shift hurt, because it is easier to grieve an icon than a woman who laughed at her own reflection when the wind turned her hair into a storm, and the city felt the pain of specificity and did not look away. The ex-boyfriend's second interview did not happen. His lawyer told him to vanish from the feed, and he did, and in his place came the friend with the phone number that had slipped up the billing logs, the friend who had drunk too much and said too much and wanted to return, and he recorded a statement where he sat very straight and tried to sound like a courthouse when he was a kitchen, and he apologized to the family in words that tasted pre-chewed, and it did not move the needle, and the voice did not air the audio, only described it, a storyteller's choice that felt like restraint or power or both. The station called the mother in. Not for a formal thing, not to put her in glare or push a permission, only to let her hear the cadence model, the part where the confession told the truth in the middle and polished the edges until they glowed. And she sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the wall clock and asked after a while whether clocks give alibis to people who obey them. And no one answered because there is no answer that would not sound like cruelty. And she left with her chin up and her voice low, and the city tightened around her like a coat in sudden rain. Science woke up again, this time wearing light. A lab pulled a whisper off the trunk gasket the way a musician pulls a melody out of noise, and the whisper was not a name, not a miracle, but a 2-fiber intersection that matched the dress manufacturer in a way that made statisticians breathe through their teeth and nod. A number with teeth of its own, the kind that can bite in court if it needs to. And the detectives did not cheer because cheering curses evidence. They only put the printout under a paperweight shaped like a turtle and went for more. They went to the bus line, spoke to drivers who work the hill at hours when the city is honest, spoke to a mechanic who remembered a scrape that left yellow paint on a mirror and black on a bus flank, and a conversation about reports no one wants to file with margins this thin. And the mechanic showed them a Polaroid he kept in a drawer of damage he photographs for insurance, a habit that turned out to be a habit with gifts, because the bus flank in the photo wore a smudge at the exact height the loaner taxi wore a bruise when the team did the reconstruction, and the smudge turned into a line, turned into a vector, turned into a diagram that felt like a story drawn with a ruler. The anonymous voice told the city to be careful. It said, do not call heroes what are only habits performing under pressure. It said, do not call villains what are only small, weak men at the wrong hour under the wrong lamp. It said, do not call solved what is only aligned, not yet nailed. It spoke in headlines and then softened them at the edges. A kindness this place does not expect, a kindness that lands like rain on a roof you did not know needed it. A rumor spiked that the voice was a cop or a reporter or a woman who had held Livia's hand once on a bus bench while they pretended not to notice a man pretending not to stare. And the rumor did not simmer. It boiled, because identity is the only currency stronger than confession, and the show responded with a trick. It aired a minute of silence from a room filled with fans bumping hot air in slow circles. A minute of nothing but presence. No words, no biography, only a room like any room in which the city has listened to itself. And when the minute ended, the voice said softly, "Keep your focus," and Rio did, for once, disciplined as a choir. Joao broke again, not at the station. At a bakery where the coffee is stronger than conscience, and the cashier recognizes him and does not know what to do, with recognition that feel like a stain. And he sat at a tiny round table and turned his cup in a slow circle, and two men at the counter spoke of the case with the casual intensity of soccer analysis, all certainty and invented numbers, and one of them used the phrase, "solved like a bludgeon," and Joao flinched, and the cashier saw, and later the cashier told her sister, and later the sister called a journalist she trusted, and the journalist did not air it, but she wrote it down as a note on the side of the page where the truth often hides, and then she went to the station and sat in a chair that has held too many eager bodies and said, in a level voice, "You need to move, because whatever is about to happen will happen loudly if you let the volume set itself." The technician coaxed the DVR into a cough that sounded like video dragging itself up a hill, and he froze a frame where a reflection lived in a window above the kiosk. A reflection of a car nose and a lamp flare and a shape that could be a license plate. If you are a believer, and a rectangle of light if you are not. And he put it through the filters that make skeptics bored and believers devout, and the rectangle did not become numbers, it became the idea of numbers, and that is not nothing, it is only not enough. And the voice told the audience exactly that, not a miracle, not a goosebump, an idea we will try to turn into a digit, and it is hard, and the city, surprisingly, stayed with hard. They went to the beach at dawn with a camera that loves old light and filmed the curve where the morning erases what the night wrote, and the guitarist who once snapped a string played again on the sand because a producer asked him to, and because the city loves symbols even when told not to, and a gull landed on the head of a saint on a chapel roof and blinked like a bored mourner. And the podcast posted 15 seconds of that dawn and asked for nothing, no call to action, no subscribe, no share. Just a small moving picture of the old wound looking almost gentle. And people saved the clip to their phones and watched it on buses and in elevators and at stoplights and felt something release in their chests that was not peace and was not rage, only a loosening of the knot. The detectives returned to the hammer. It is always the small object that betrays the big lie. They found the shop where Joao bought it, a corner place that stocks every cheap thing that can break and be replaced. And the owner remembered a man with the posture of someone always ready for impact, remembered the week because a shipment came in wrong and he had to argue about returns, remembered the brand because it bends at the neck like a bad thought, and he produced a receipt book with carbon copies that had bled into each other through humidity and carelessness. And one slip showed a date you could read if you tilted the page and squinted, and the date made the analyst put a finger on the timeline and say, "Here. Look, here is the hour where intention bought a tool, and maybe the tool was for a hinge or a shelf or a nail, but its weight matches the history described, and again this was not a body, but it was the ache of one." The city kept dressing the story in costumes, and the voice kept undressing it, and between those motions a curious tenderness grew, the tenderness of a crowd that understands its appetite and is ashamed of it and still cannot stop eating, and the tenderness of a storyteller who knows that appetite saved this case from the warehouse of dust, but might eat the family alive if it is not fed correctly. And so the show cut the music and cut the flourish and cut the adjectives and let silence do the heavy lifting. And the silence sounded like a stairwell at 2 a.m., and a kitchen at 6 a.m., and a courtroom at 10 a.m., the 3 hours where truth likes to show up. Late that night, a message hit the podcast inbox with a photo attached, a rearview mirror, a cheap plastic rosary coiled like a sleeping snake, a glove compartment stuffed with repair slips. The caption said, simply, "I rode with him. I remember the way he fixed the latch with a prayer and a curse. I remember the laugh in the back, and I need to say it out loud." The voice did not air the photo. It read the caption softly. It let the city feel the weight of an ordinary memory stepping forward. Outside, heat clung to the buildings like a second coat of paint. The ocean kept its counsel. The mother set the radio to a number that meant nothing and everything and went to bed with the candle moved away from the window. Not extinguished, only moved, as if making space for whatever the night would carry back. And on a desk under fluorescent light, the timeline breathed. a red line through a map of a hill where bus brakes still hiss and gulls still complain and a single missing minute still walks beside the living as if it owns the sidewalk. They decided to count the city's heartbeats because sometimes the body of a case hides inside the body of a place, and they set up microphones on the hill and on the beach road and in the alley behind the bar, gathering the sound of night-like evidence, the hiss of bus brakes, the clack of a trunk in a test car, the rattle of loose screws on a kiosk shutter. And they layered the tracks until a pattern rose like a watermark, a faint shape that suggested a pause at the curve, a scrape, a knock, a breath held and not released. And while the technicians did that quiet magic, the detectives moved in straight lines to the shop where the hammer bent, to the dispatch desk where the notes bled, to a garage where a man remembered replacing a latch spring on a model no one loved because the trunk always caught. And he remembered the customer brought his own hammer because he did not trust shop tools. And he remembered the customer kept saying later under his breath like a prayer that could rewind time. And the receipt had no name, only numbers. But the numbers found a twin in a notebook from a summer shift at the taxi office, and the twins made a mirror, and in that mirror the outline of the driver sharpened. The anonymous voice understood momentum like a surgeon understands blood loss. It slowed the cut when the city's pulse dipped, it pressed when the pressure needed to rise, and in the new episode it did something you could feel in your ribs. It addressed the driver by a first name that might be real and might be a common mask, and it said, "You have already begun to save a life, your own. By telling the shape of your damage, you can finish the act by telling where the night finally put its hands," and the voice let the silence after that sentence sit open, a cup waiting for water. And in that open space, the city poured speculation, mercy, rage, and a thread of something older than law, the hunger for the last location, the precise corner where the legend stops moving and becomes a place you can touch. The prosecutor's office woke up to a chorus it could not ignore, and a careful woman with a neat desk and a memory for dates began to assemble a file that could stand in court without shaking. Nothing theatrical, nothing viral, only the architecture of proof, a scaffold built out of audio cadence, mechanical repair habits, drift models that told what the ocean would and would not accept, a tender pair of fibers that refused to forget what color they had touched, a technician's stubbornness that coaxed a ghostly rectangle out of a summer DVR. And she knew that a defense would come hard with the word maybe, would stab at each notch and each hinge and each habit as if doubt were a blade that could slice a timeline clean. So she found a witness the city would not expect, not a neighbor and not an ex and not a driver on the line. A woman who cleaned the back office at the taxi yard and who remembered the broken latch because she had once leaned into the trunk to fetch a spare jack, and the edge bit her forearm and she swore, and the driver laughed and then apologized and offered her a cloth, and she took it. And the cloth smelled like gasoline and talc, a strange, clean mix that made her think of a body shop and a nursery at the same time. And memory lives in that kind of smell. It roots in, it waits, and when she told the story, it did not prove anything alone, but it pressed weight on a side of the scale that needed weight. Cameras started living in the mother's street, blinks of glass under afternoon glare, and she drew the curtains and set a plate for dinner and put her palm flat on the table beside the empty chair, a gesture that looked like prayer and was not, only an agreement with the past to hold steady while strangers negotiated with the future, and the radio whispered the anonymous voice at low volume, the sentences short, the speed just faster than a walk, and the mother closed her eyes and saw her daughter in the red dress coming down the hallway in a rush because the phone rang and the sandals clicked like a clock running out. A small trouble grew around the podcast. Fans wrote theories and threads that braided into ropes that sometimes turned into nooses for the wrong neck, and the voice cut in to say, "Do not hunt, do not name who we have not named. Do not make yourselves detectives unless you are ready to sit with evidence that does not love you back." And some listened and some did not, because the internet is a sea that pretends to be a map, and a handful of strangers decided they knew the face behind the voice, and published a name and an address, and a photo of a woman who had nothing to do with Livia, except the misfortune of living near an old rumor. And the city recoiled, and the voice went quiet for 6 hours and then returned steadier, with a line about harm and hunger. And the episode after that carried only one new fact and 20 minutes of context, an act that felt like restraint and landed like discipline. Joan's world shrank to rooms with chairs and rooms with coffee, to the long, narrow street between his door and the station, to the bench outside the bakery where pigeons practiced indifference. And in that reduced geography, the past grew, the way vines grow on a wall left unattended, busy and patient. And he found himself narrating the small movements of the original night as if accuracy were absolution, how the bus elbow felt like insult, how the laugh in the back seat sounded like a dare or a cough or a word bitten in half, how the latch caught and how his brain split into two cheap choices with no wisdom between them, and in the retelling he kept failing to find a sentence that did not end in that dark corner where silence thickens, and the detectives let him fail, and then tried again, and then brought water, and then let him go home because a confession is not a harvest. You can rush, it is a weather system, you wait out. The guitarist in the bar, the one whose string had once snapped like a fuse, became a small, accidental chorus. He wrote a song that was mostly a scale and a rhythm, no lyrics, only the sound of a careful climb and the soft tap of a pick against wood that mimicked that up, down trunk rhythm without turning it into a gimmick, and a producer from the show recorded him on the sand at dawn again and used the clip without credits. Only the city will recognize itself. And people did, and they argued again about taste and grief and art. And in the arguing, you could feel a different energy than the first wave, less fever, more stamina, the shift from sprint to marathon that a long case demands. A note slid under the station door, not typed, not careful, a pencil scrawl that said the hill has a second way out, the one no one uses in the wet season. Look for tire grooves that cross themselves. Look where oil makes a rainbow on puddles that never dry, simple, childlike, useful, like. 2 officers took a camera and walked the ditch path behind the warehouses and found exactly that, thin dark signatures curving over each other like impatient handwriting. And in a low spot where runoff gathered, they saw a line of grit pressed into the mud at the height where a trunk edge would skim if a driver pulled up close and yanked and cursed. And this was not law school proof, no. But it was the feeling of a body passing, the impression of a night leaving a bruise on the earth it crossed, and they flagged it and photographed it and mapped it onto the reconstruction until the line of the case drew itself like a river that had finally found its bed. The prosecutor made a decision that her office would be criticized for in 2 directions at once. She would not announce charges until the forensic lab signed every page with numbers that could walk in front of a jury without shame, and she would move to detain the driver on a lesser charge, obstruction, disposal, a pair of words that taste like metal and ash, to keep him from stepping sideways into a hole the city would never forgive itself for allowing, and this bought time and also lit another fire. The debate about mercy, punishment, intent, accident, choice, all the heavy coins we trade when a cold case turns hot enough to burn our pockets. The anonymous voice did not tell anyone what to think. It told them what the record could hold. It told them where the record bent and where it refused to bend, and it reminded the city of the small parts, the coaster at the bar shaped like a postcard, the snapped string, the red snag near the ribs, the smell of gasoline and talc, the bus flank with its yellow bruise and a Polaroid, the way a cashier watched a man flinch at the word solved and did not know where to put her eyes, and the way a mother moved a candle away from a window but refused to extinguish it. Another rumor tried to grow teeth. It said there had been a black car. It said the driver had not been alone. It said men from a different hill had eaten the city's story like they eat everything. And the detectives fed the rumor to maps and phone logs and cameras and found it dissolved like sugar in hot water, sweet and nothing. And they said so out loud, and the voice amplified it because myths have to be denied with the same energy with which they are born, or they will learn to walk. Night work brought a new quiet thing. The technician cracked the DVR image further and pulled out 6 stable frames in a row, and in the reflection you could see a shape that was not a license plate, but was a logo sticker on the edge of a windshield. A childish sticker the city knows. A soccer mascot with its tongue out. A detail no one would remove for a crime, because criminals do not erase their small joys, they forget them. And a photo from the taxi yard archive, a faded snapshot of a lineup at a company picnic, showed 3 cars with that sticker in that season, and one of those cars belonged to the driver who left and moved north and never filed an address, and later learned to breathe with a timeline pressed between his ribs. And this was the kind of small, ridiculous, human marker that juries trust more than algorithms, and the prosecutor underlined it and felt the case exhale. They went looking for the dress, not to recover it, to reconstruct it. The manufacturer still kept a sample book, threads and swatches in a binder that smelled like glue and memory, and the red carried a dye signature that made a lab smile the way only certainty makes a scientist smile. And the gasket whisper matched that signature at a rate that statisticians like to argue about, but laymen feel in the spine. And the analyst marked the percentage in her cadence notebook as if numbers could be sung. And she closed the book and went to the window and watched a bus drag itself uphill and wondered what forgiveness sounds like in a room that has only heard evidence. The day they moved on, Joao was bright and windless and smelled like hot stone. No cuffs at the door, no parade, a quiet knock. a walk in shoes that felt heavy because he could feel the city's eyes at his back even when no one watched. At the station, he sat and breathed and did not try to tell a cleaner story. He did not try to be a monster or a martyr. He was a small, weak man at the wrong hour under the wrong lamp who made a choice that ate all the other choices, and he said the corner where the night put its hands. And it was not a dramatic location, not a cliff, not a place with a legend, only a low spot by a wall where water collects after rain, a place street sweepers know, a corner so ordinary that the city had walked past it 1,000,000 times without letting it into memory, and now it would never leave. They brought the mother in with a cousin beside her and a priest who said very little because silence is a better instrument than scripture in rooms like this, and they asked if she wanted to hear the words in the driver's mouth or read them later in a transcript, and she said she wanted the version that hurt less, and they told her there is no such version, and she nodded, like she had known the answer, and had asked only to let the room hear itself say it, and she listened and kept her hand flat on the table, and when the sentence ended, she did not cry, and she did not praise, and she did not curse. She asked if the ocean had taken what it always takes, and the pathologist said, the ocean takes and keeps and sometimes returns in pieces that are not useful to courts but that matter to mothers, and the mother nodded again and stood and left, and the candle in her kitchen did not flicker because there was no wind, only heat, and heat does not move, it presses. The anonymous voice did not run a victory lap. It played the guitarist scale. It thanked the technician by trade, not by name. It told the city to stop saying solved as if the word were a disinfectant. It said solved is a status code, not a sacrament. It said the bruise will remain, and that is not a failure. That is what it means to be honest, and it closed with a sentence that could have been a headline, colder cases, warmer hearts, smaller appetites, and the city took it as a dare. Night fell, and the hill looked like a chest rising and falling. Buses hissed, gulls complained, a bar set out a coaster, and no one sat at the corner table. A driver in a different taxi tapped his trunk with 2 fingers the way gamblers tap a table for luck, and he did not know why he did it, only that the city had learned a new superstition. And in a low spot by a wall where water collects after rain, tape fluttered in a breath of air that no one felt anywhere else, a thin red string snapping once and then going still, as if the case itself had finally matched the city's heartbeat and decided to rest. They called the next stretch the quiet storm, the hours when microphones slept but rumor did not. When court calendars were still blank but pens hovered, and in that charged pause the city learned to breathe differently, slower in the chest and quicker in the mind, and the anonymous voice answered with an episode that began not with a hook but with a mirror. It turned the lens on us and asked what we think solved means when a mother still counts her steps to the kitchen chair like beads of a rosary, when a driver sits in a room with white walls and admits to a night that tilted his life off its axis, when a prosecutor stacks small proofs until they feel like a single brick, and then tests the weight with both hands, and the voice said, we mistake endings for exits. We forget that a cold case, once warmed, heats everything near it, and so we will walk through the heat together, and we will not look away when it burns. And then it laid out the day in ordinary pieces that felt electric anyway, because that is what happens when a city believes it is watching itself change. The garage man returned with a memory he had not trusted at first. The way a mechanic sometimes hears a noise in a dream and wakes knowing which bolt is to blame. And he said the latch spring he replaced that season had the oddest scrape mark. Not from age, from a tool, not a clean factory line, a bite, a shallow crescent like a jaw with one tooth missing, and the analyst set that word next to the audio cadence spikes at the latch moment, and the 2 details glowed a little in a way only pattern lovers see, and the prosecutor wrote the phrase tool bite in her neat script and underlined it because juries remember images that can live on a kitchen table. Reporters began to arrive at the hill in greater numbers and in worse shoes, and neighbors who had been generous grew tired, the fatigue that comes when privacy is harvested without permission. So the detectives moved some of the work to back streets and borrowed offices, and still the microphones found them, and the city began to recognize a new cast by the shape of their shoulders in silhouette, the technician with the careful hands, the analyst with the cadence notebook, the prosecutor with the tidy desk and the memory for dates. And in that recognition came affection, not hero worship, only the affection a place reserves for citizens who do their jobs in a way that feels like a hand on a burning pan, steady and practical and brave without decoration. Juon sat with a public defender in a cup that never seemed empty, and he tried to build sentences that did not collapse under their own shame, and the lawyer kept pulling him back to the bones, to the parts that carry weight, to the detail that matches the receipt, to the turn that lines up with the bus flank bruise. to the trunk edge that kissed a puddle at that low spot by that wall. And the lawyer said something not many want to hear on days like these, that truth and punishment are not twins, and sometimes they do not even share a surname. And Joao nodded, as if that felt like a mercy, when it is mostly just a map. The anonymous voice released a short, almost a fragment, a spare 6 minutes that did nothing but spool out a timeline again, hour by hour, minute by minute, not to sensationalize, to engrave. Because repetition is how the city remembers and how a jury learns to breathe with a story. And in that short, the voice tucked a new and almost ridiculous detail between the known beats, the way the guitarist had tuned that night to a D that sat slightly flat because it was humid and the bar's ceiling fan dragged the air down. A detail that means nothing to a file and everything to a mood, the precise shade of the hour, and suddenly the red dress in the doorway flashes again in a mind like heat lightning, and the entire machine of attention re-engages. A new tension sprang up around the voice, because success breeds suspicion, and curiosity is a beast that chews on the hand that feeds it, and amateur sleuths sharpened their guesses about who was speaking in our ears. A reporter, a cop, a neighbor, a childhood friend, a stranger who made a vocation of empathy, and a name trended again. Wrong again, and this time the voice did not retreat. It advanced with clarity. It said, "Identity is not evidence, and I will not become the headline. The headline is the woman who wore the red dress and left a room filled with music and never came back." And that line steadied the fever, not entirely, but enough, the way a teacher's stare can settle a class that wants to run. The lab signed another page with numbers that did not sing but did not wobble either, and those numbers bound the two fiber whisper to the dress swatch book in a manner that made the prosecutor nod in that small way that is almost a smile. And the analyst updated her cadence ledger and set it next to a diagram of the ditch path where the tires had crossed themselves, and the picture on the board began to look less like a myth and more like a route a human could have walked without vanishing into legend. And that is when the city did something strange. It softened. You could feel it in line at the bakery, in the sighs in buses, in the way a bartender set a coaster on the bar with a gentler hand, as if impact were no longer the only way to be present. The ex-boyfriend remained invisible on camera, and his lawyer remained loud, and the case file did not care about either because it had learned to carry itself without the show. And the notes from the dispatch desk, and the receipt with the bent hammer, and the Polaroid with the yellow bruise, and the technician's fragile DVR frames, and the sticker mascot with its tongue out, and the shop owner's memory of a shipment arriving wrong, and the janitor's story about the cloth that smelled like gasoline and talc. All of it felt like gears that had finally found each other, still grinding, still loud, but moving forward in a way you could plot with a ruler. The mother went out at dusk one evening, the first time since the station room, and she walked to the chapel with the saint on the roof, and she did not pray because she had spoken to God in kitchens for 24 years and had nothing new to add. She simply sat on the back pew and listened to the building breathe, wood settling, pipes ticking, and when she stood to go, the guitarist, who had been hired to play a fundraiser the next day, tested a run of notes, and she closed her eyes at the sound, not because it reminded her of anything, but because it did not accuse her of anything either, and she thanked him with a nod and went home and turned the radio to the number that had become a ritual and waited for the voice. Bureaucracy finally touched the case with its slow hands as it must, and requests for records went out and returns came back, and some of the returns had pages blacked out and some did not. And in those stripes of absence, the city found new appetites, new rooms for theory, and the voice told us to take care with the black bars, to see them as the dull function of a system and not as a guarantee of scandal. And it explained in simple words how a file is cut to fit through legal doors. And it asked us to hold our fire for facts that would behave in court. And this was not as thrilling as a twist, but it felt like strength, the kind of strength that makes a place feel less like a rumor mill and more like a town with a spine. A small break did come, the kind a story earns after it has paid its dues to patience. The kiosk owner, the man with the box under the bed and the DVR that coughed itself back to life, found at the bottom of that box a bag of summer receipts he had thrown in years ago when the printer jammed and he had to write sales by hand, and one slip was from the night after the disappearance, a cash sale for bottled water that included an extra line because the buyer had insisted on breaking a larger bill and asked for change all in coins, and the owner had written down the car he believed the buyer came from, not the plate, only the model and a sticker note to remind himself, the childish mascot tongue out because he had thought it funny, and the timestamp on his wall clock, adjusted for the old power cut that month, put that buyer near the low wall at an hour that fit the timeline like a puzzle edge, and the handwriting was his and the detail ordinary and therefore trustworthy. and the prosecutor stapled it into the stack, and the analyst put a star by the hour. The defense prepared to argue that ordinary details are the easiest to mistake, and they are right, and still the picture grew. In the bakery line, two men who had argued like soccer commentators on week 1 now spoke softer. They said the word accident with less certainty and the word choice with more, and the cashier watched them and thought of the flinch at the word solved and wondered what words do to bodies when they are thrown like stones, and she decided to speak when called, not for revenge, for balance, because rumor had weight and her small observation deserved to live on the same scale. The anonymous voice trailed the new receipts with care, and then did something like an exhale. It aired a call with a retired pathologist who spoke not of wounds, but of the physics of water at night on that curve of the beach, the drag across fabric, the drift, the return of fragments, and the voice let the science stand without drama, and that calm felt like an adult in the room, and in that calm, the city allowed grief to float up without camouflage, less rage, more ache, a different weather. The court set a preliminary hearing date, and the news crawls finally had numbers to print, and the prosecutor filed the obstruction and disposal counts with the confidence of someone who knows when to stop pressing and when to save pressure for later. And the public defender filed motions that were neither cynical nor naive, tools, not gestures, and Joao signed papers and stared at the table, and then looked up and asked a question no one expected. He asked whether the episodes would keep airing, and the officer said yes, this is the age we live in. And he nodded like a man counting the cost of being a character in a story he did not write. The city's appetite tried to surge again, parades of takes, but fatigue met it halfway, and the anonymous voice used that opening to reframe the lens. It played 2 minutes of room tone from the station corridor, the sound of shoes, the hum of a light ballast, a distant coffee machine grumbling, and then it faded in the guitarist's scale again and read a list of names without surnames, not suspects, helpers, the technician, the bus mechanic with the Polaroid habit, the janitor with the talc-scented cloth, the kiosk owner with the box under the bed, the dispatcher who cracked on later, the cashier who saw a flinch and did not know where to put her eyes. And in that roll call, the city felt something like ownership without possession, the sense that a cold case is not solved by a single hero, but by a weather system of people doing small, careful things in a sequence that looks like luck from far away and like devotion from up close. Night leaned in again, humid and close, the ocean unreadable, the lamps a little kinder, and on the low spot by the wall. The tape did not flutter this time. It lay still, red against gray, a thin line across a place that will never again be ordinary. And at the bar, the guitarist finished his climb and let his hand rest, and the bartender set one coaster at the corner and then, thoughtfully, set a second beside it, because grief asks for company even when no one is sitting there, and the radio in a kitchen ticked from one number to the next, and the candle stayed where it was, not an invitation any longer, a memorial. And the headline that started this story felt less like a shock and more like the first sentence of a chapter the city intends to read all the way through. They called the hearing a formality, as if ritual could make heat behave, but the morning arrived with a charged hush that felt anything but routine, a sky the color of tin, the flag hanging without a ripple, the courthouse steps crowded with cameras that preferred movement and found stillness unnerving. And in that stillness, the city examined itself like a bruise in a mirror and decided it would show up and watch the system breathe. Inside, fluorescent light flattened faces into masks, and the air conditioning clicked like a metronome that had lost count. And Joao sat at the defense table with the posture of a man who keeps trying to fit his shoulders back into a life that no longer welcomes them. The public defender steady beside him, the prosecutor neat and exact with a thin stack that looked too small to carry so much weight, and a clerk called the case in a voice that belonged to no neighborhood and all of them at once. The judge looked like every judge the city has ever seen, tired in the eyes, calm in the mouth, disciplined in the hands, and she asked simple questions in the tone of someone who knows simplicity is the only bridge that will hold in a storm. The phrase cold case moved across the room with the gravity of a ship passing just offshore, and the people in the gallery leaned without realizing they leaned. The anonymous voice did not go live from the hallway. It refused the instant hit. Instead, the episode that dropped that night began with the sound of a pen tapping once on a desk, and then a line that felt like a teacher taking attendance. Present are the facts that survived. Present are the habits that betrayed their owners. Present are the small human markers that juries trust more than math. Present are the limits of certainty and the mercy that might be found just outside those limits. And present is the grief that does not clock out at lunch. It recapped without adornment and then pressed forward into the hour that mattered, the part where an old summer DVR and a sticker and a Polaroid and a bent hammer and a pair of fibers tried to carry the weight that a body should have carried and could not. The prosecutor stood. She did not tell a story. She placed bricks. She spoke of the obstruction and the disposal counts with the restraint of someone who has learned that a courtroom punishes the flavor that a crowd craves. And as she laid out the pieces, the analyst sat in the second row. Cadence notebook closed, fingers resting on its cover as if guarding a pulse, and the technician sat beside her, thumbs flecked with a permanent film of grease that soap never conquers, and the bus mechanic who kept Polaroids of damage in a drawer pressed his knees together and held his hat in both hands like a student waiting for his name. The public defender rose and did the work that keeps the city honest. He showed the slack in the rope. He said ordinary details are the cheapest currency in memory. He said the word maybe with the confidence of a carpenter testing a plank before he steps on it. He asked for the bright line the law prefers and the case did not yet have. He did not sneer at grief and did not flatter outrage. He built his own scaffold of doubt and it did not creak. The judge listened without changing her weather. The mother did not attend. She stayed in the kitchen where the radio knows her name and the candle has learned to watch without begging. She washed a cup she had already washed and dried it again and set it on the table beside the empty chair and then moved it an inch. The tiny choreography of a day that refuses to decide whether ritual is medicine or poison. The guitarist walked past the courthouse with his case slung and did not stop because some rooms turn music into lacquer and he prefers wood that breathes. In the hallway after, a reporter asked the prosecutor whether solved is the correct word for a headline yet, and she said words are not badges, they do not confer authority. And the reporter nodded like she understood and then asked the public defender whether accident is still possible, and he said possible is a wide plain and justice is a narrow road through it, and the hallway swallowed those sentences like a stone building swallows summer heat. Outside on the steps, the microphones found the wrong faces first. They always do. Men who speak in the hot declarative and women who ask for blood in a voice that tries to sound like balm. And behind them, the cashier from the bakery looked down at her hands and decided to continue doing the small, true thing she had always done, tell only what she saw and leave the parade to others. The episode that night pulled a small truth out of the noise. It aired 30 seconds of the courtroom's room tone, the grinding patience of a machine that has processed too many lives to care about the poetry of any single one, and over that hum the voice spoke quietly about weight. It said the city is learning to feel the difference between drama and gravity. It said we are discovering that an absence can be heavy enough to pull a crowd into orbit around it without spectacle. It said the law cannot offer absolution, only process, and sometimes process is the most moral form of attention a place can sustain. And it let those words sit without music, which made them heavier still. In the days after, the investigation continued in a key so low you felt it in the chest more than heard it. The janitor from the taxi yard came in and repeated the story about the cloth and the gasoline and the talc and added a small coda she had forgotten, that the driver had offered her not just a cloth but a small joke, the kind men use when they are afraid a woman will name the moment. And the joke was bad, and she had not laughed, and he had smiled anyway with all his teeth, and the analyst wrote down the joke, not because it would help in court, but because human weather patterns often predict storms better than instruments. The mechanic produced a second Polaroid none of us knew about, one he had not filed because insurance never came for it, a shot of a different flank on a different week with a different set of scrapes that nonetheless aligned on a diagram like wind lines drawn on a weather map, and the technician overlaid the frames and drew a thin chalk syllable where they met. And that syllable felt like the sound of a trunk when the latch gives after a stubborn minute, and the room went very still. A taxi dispatcher from those years, not the dying one, the other one whose memory lives in ledger lines and coffee rings, found a note in the margin of a shift log he had almost thrown away. A star beside a call marked later, the same word that cracked the first dispatcher's voice, and the star belonged to the only driver who had asked to switch to the hill for a week and then switch back without explanation. A habit that might be nothing, except habits are the footprints of intent, and the prosecutor copied the page and filed it and never raised her voice. Joao asked for a moment with the investigator who had treated him most like a person and least like a metaphor. In that small room, he tried again to say the shape of remorse without asking for receipt or discount. He did not ask for mercy. He did not wear sackcloth. He asked whether telling the coroner would be enough, whether a mother needed a map to breathe, and the investigator did not answer with a rule. He answered with a story of his own, about a brother who drowned when they were young and a shoreline that became unbearable until someone named a rock and a current and a wind, and then unbearable turned into a burden that could be lifted with 2 hands if you took turns. Joao nodded, as if that exchange had offered him a job he could finally do. The rumor machine tried to find a new villain and failed. It went back to the anonymous podcast and gnawed at the question of identity again, because mystery as product is easier than mystery as wound, and the voice answered with a trick it had used before and now sharpened. It put other people's voices at the center for a whole episode. The janitor, the mechanic, the dispatcher, the technician, edited to keep their cadences intact. The ums and oohs preserved, the grammar left to stumble and then catch itself, and the effect was bracing. A removal of polish that made the case feel less like content and more like inventory. A shipment of small truths arriving at a loading dock where the city had lined up to sign for them. The bar where Livia left the red dress behind in the doorway received a letter with no return address and a 10-reel bill inside, and a note that said, for the unfinished caipirinha that sweated onto a postcard coaster, sorry for the wait, and the bartender taped the bill to the back of a shelf and kept it there as a promise to finish what was started, not because money matters in a ritual, because intent does. The chapel with the saint on the roof held a fundraiser, and the guitarist played the scale that had become a quiet anthem, and he added a final note he had been avoiding, the small release that lets a climb land without collapsing, and people wiped their eyes with the backs of their hands and blamed the humidity, and no one corrected them. The ocean remained rude and secret, as it always is, but the pathologist came back on the air and taught the city a word it had not used. Persistence, the way certain materials cling where others wash clean. The way a dye signature refuses to surrender when everything else has dissolved. And the voice let the word sit there as a definition of grief as much as forensic fact. The judge set the next date. The prosecutor fine-tuned the architecture of the case and rehearsed the moment when she would ask the city to accept that disposal, and obstruction can be enough to dignify a life that the ocean would not return. The public defender tuned his own instrument to that pitch, where responsibility and penalty are separate notes that must be played together if truth is to sound like something other than vengeance. And the analyst closed her cadence book and placed it on a shelf as if shelving a hymn, not because the music had ended, because the movement had shifted key. Late one night, the anonymous voice left the city with a question it had avoided until then. It asked what we do with our appetite when the main course is finally served. It asked whether we can learn to eat smaller. It asked whether we can stay in rooms where process outlasts suspense. Then it did nothing clever. It played 30 seconds of the low spot by the wall, recorded at dusk, insects buzzing, a distant bus sighing, tape tapping gently in a breeze you could not see, and you could feel the city choose to keep listening, even though the fireworks were done. A mother slept without the radio on for the first time in years. A driver stared at a ceiling he finally recognized as a ceiling and not a sky that had fallen. A prosecutor sharpened a pencil and wrote a line she would deliver without drama. A mechanic put a Polaroid back in a drawer and closed it with a satisfied push. And somewhere a young woman in a red dress walked out of a bar in a city that does not forget and into a night that had learned, at last, to call itself by its real name. They called the days that followed a negotiation with weather, because the heat did not break, and neither did the story. It only changed pressure, moving from thunderheads to a dense, breathable haze. And in that hazy air, the city tried to learn a slower choreography, less sprinting toward shock, more standing with weight evenly distributed, more listening for signals that arrive without sirens. The prosecutor met the public defender in a conference room whose carpet drank spilled coffee and old arguments with the same weary grace, and they spoke in plain timber about terms that never satisfy anyone entirely, the way accountability can be measured without pretending a scale will ever feel like a soul, and they moved pieces on a whiteboard not to manipulate, to align, because alignment is what keeps a case from falling through the gaps that grief digs when no one is looking. And outside, on the street 2 floors below, buses exhaled, gulls scolded the air, and a woman pushing a cart of Guaraná cans called out in a voice that made every head turn for reasons that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with belonging. The anonymous voice recorded a different kind of episode, an hour that refused to boil, choosing instead to simmer to keep the lid slightly ajar and let the city watch the steam as proof that something was cooking that could not be rushed without turning bitter. And it opened with a small domestic picture, the mother adjusting the candle wick with a pin and wiping the soot from the glass with the hem of a dish towel, a gesture that signaled both tidying and stewardship, as if she curated the museum of a single hour and would not allow dust to rewrite its captions. And then the voice slid back to the table where terms were turned over like river stones: disposal, obstruction, custodial time that maps to years the city had been holding its breath. conditions that acknowledge a confession that wasn't poetry but might be the next truest thing. Juan sat with his lawyer afterward and listened as the words built a box around his life that did not look like a coffin and did not look like freedom either, a practical architecture of consequence. And he nodded at the parts that touched the night's machinery, the latch, the bus, the ditch, and winced at the parts that named the hours after, the choices to move, to sell, to sand down the surface of a trunk that had learned the shape of a dress. And he asked one question that made the room change temperature. He asked whether the agreement would let him speak again, not to the microphones waiting outside, to the one person who had been keeping a chair at the table for a quarter century. And the lawyer said there are channels for that, but channels are not rivers, and you cannot swim them without permission. And Joao stared at his hands and said, "Permission is a kind of air, and I have been living without it for so long I forgot what breathing can feel like." The guitarist wrote a bridge for his quiet anthem and tried it out in the bar at an hour when the ceiling fan dragged the notes lower than he intended, and the bartender, who had taken to setting 2 coasters at the corner and leaving them there like place markers for the living and the gone, nodded without looking up, because the city felt ready for bridges, not because they are pretty, but because they do the ugly job of getting people from one side to the other without pretending the drop beneath isn't real. The analyst took her cadence notebook back off the shelf and opened it to a page that had been waiting since the first confession, a blank space she had left for the part where a voice either deepens or frays, and she listened to Joao in the small rooms where process lives, not for content, for texture, the way certain words sit on his tongue as if they have teeth, the way certain silences feel like a man laying a tool down on a bench and stepping back to see if it will move on its own. And she noted without triumph that the center of the story still rang true and the edges still polished themselves smooth, and that this was what grief looks like when it grows callous. And she closed the book gently and went to the window where the hill in the distance kept its private weather, and the buses still hissed, and the curve still waited like a sentence without a period. The city, restless by nature, tried to turn the anonymous voice into a parade again, and in answer the show brought us into a room we had not seen. The garage with the bent hammer brand poster still curling at the corners. The workbench where a mechanic's hand remembered a bite mark on a spring that matched a habit that matched a choice. And the voice let the camera of the mind sit on that bench for a full minute, describing screws in a jar, rag folded to a perfect square, a radio turned low to a football match that had been played years ago and still managed to raise a cheer out of a man working alone. And that minute did something a shouting headline never could. It put patience on the table as an object you could pick up and turn in your hands. A mural appeared on the wall near the bar without anyone claiming it. A red dress sketched in strokes that looked like wind and flame at once. A coastline drawn with a single blue line and a radio rendered as a small black rectangle that somehow felt louder than speakers. And below it, not a name, only the words, "We keep listening." And for 2 mornings, pigeons sat on the saint's head on the chapel roof and stared down at the paint as if the city had given them a new piece of sky to consider, and people stopped and took photos and then stopped taking photos and just stood, which is rarer and braver. The prosecutor visited the mother with no cameras and no statements to collect, only papers to explain in a language that belongs to courtrooms and never fits kitchens, and she laid out the terms like dishes and did not pretend any of them would satisfy hunger. And the mother listened as if to a lesson she already knew the answers to, and at the end she asked a question that sounded simple and wasn't. She asked whether the word solved is something the file writes to itself or something the living have a say in. And the prosecutor, who had made a discipline of not performing, allowed herself a humility that made the room kinder. She said the word solved in the law is a door that closes behind a process, but the word solved in a house is a door that never closes without catching, and sometimes it never closes at all. And the mother looked at the candle and said, "Then let us not pretend a latch that still sticks is anything but what it is." The public defender, who had made a habit of refusing easy drama, went on the record in the hallway after the next hearing and said into a microphone that has misquoted men daily for a century that compromise is not a capitulation when it puts the right weight on the right hour, and the city surprised itself by not jeering, by not demanding fire for warmth, by allowing a cool draft of reason to pass through the crush without hissing. The rumor engine sputtered and tried a new fuel, money, connections, conspiracies with international passports, and the detectives fed it documents until it flooded and died. A kindness dressed as a scolding, and the voice devoted a segment to literacy for the layperson, teaching the fine print of records requests and redactions, teaching how absence on a page does not guarantee the presence of scandal, how the black bar is sometimes only a seatbelt protecting a witness from a crash we cannot see. And it was not thrilling, and it was not shareable, and it was exactly the adult tone the city needed to borrow and keep. Joao's circle shrank further and then strangely widened. Letters arrived, fragile, furious, forgiving, foolish, wise, sometimes all in the same paragraph, and the officer who screened them kept a few that felt like medicine and allowed them through with care. And Joao read about daughters walked to school with keys clenched between fingers, about sons warned by mothers never to sit behind a driver on a deserted road, about an aunt who lost a niece in a different year, under a different sky, and carried the weight in her back until a confession she never heard lifted it a fraction and taught her how to tilt her body without dropping it on her own heart. And he cried the way men who have practiced not crying for decades cry, quietly at first, and then like a roof letting go in a storm. And the investigator who had told him the story about the brother and the current stood in the doorway and did not interrupt because mercy without permission is just another kind of theft. The podcast aired one more experiment. It asked 3 people to read the same paragraph from the confession, not to see which voice carried authority, to hear how truth changes key depending on who holds it in their mouth. A retired pathologist whose sentences were careful as stitches, the janitor whose vowels carried the bright courage of a woman who has learned to claim space with her elbows in her stories, and the bus mechanic whose laugh kept sneaking into the silence like a friend who refuses to let grief monopolize a room. And the paragraph sounded different each time and the same each time. And listeners wrote in to say they felt steadier and smaller, and somehow better, like a person leaving a chapel after admitting they cannot solve the problem of the ocean but can pick up trash on the sand. At the edge of all this, life did what it always does when a narrative tries to occupy every square meter of a city. It insisted on its own noise. School bells rang. A storm finally kicked the heat aside for an afternoon and left the streets shining like a new set of teeth. The guitarist missed a note and smiled without apology. The bar served a caipirinha to a couple who had not been old enough to drink when the red dress stepped through the door the first time, and the woman raised her glass in the direction of the mural without turning it into a performance, a small acknowledgement, a toast that was more about attention than alcohol. And the low wall by the ditch, the corner that had become a coordinate in the city's private atlas, held its new silence like a vow, not empty, attentive, a place where people paused and then moved on without telling themselves lies. When the plea finally shaped itself, it did so without pageantry. Papers slid, pens touched down, a judge spoke in the voice furniture learns to recognize. The word acceptance appeared on a line that had been waiting for it. The prosecutor looked up once at no one and everyone. The defender touched his client's sleeve and let his hand fall. The mother did not attend and did not need to because her presence had become the grammar of the case. A steady subject the city conjugated in every tense, and at home she adjusted the candle wick one more time and this time did not light it, not because hope had died, because the light had learned to live in other rooms. That night the episode was shorter than anyone expected, a deliberate refusal to extend a scene that had earned its own end, and it gave us only what belonged to us, the timeline, the terms, the reminders, the names without surnames, the scale without melody, and a closing injunction that felt like a benediction for a place that is tired and still faithful. Keep listening, keep your appetite small, keep your mercy large, keep your eyes on the corner and your hands on the work that grief assigns. And then the guitarist's bridge, a climb that lands where it should. And silence, the kind you can sit in without feeling alone. They called the next morning the day the paperwork learned to breathe, because pages that had been dead weight for months suddenly carried pulse, signatures like small heartbeats across white fields, and the city, hungry for spectacle and learning to choose restraint instead, woke to a sky rinsed clean by the storm, pavements shining, buses leaving damp commas at every stop, gulls gossiping like old ladies in a bakery line, and everything felt both ordinary and newly responsible, as if the streets themselves had accepted a plea. The anonymous voice did not rush to declare a victory lap or an elegy. It opened with a kettle coming to a boil and a window opening to let out steam, a small domestic gesture that said, "We will keep the pressure manageable. We will not varnish this." And then it moved through the facts with a calm that could be mistaken for cool, until you noticed the way it let the listener catch up. The pauses placed like stepping stones over a creek. Joao remained where the process kept him, a room where the fluorescent light removed weather from faces, where chairs remembered the weight of men who had admitted less and asked more, and he began the work the law had assigned, the small humiliations and larger reckonings that come with accepting that your life will be measured by a rubric instead of a story. And in that new routine he asked once more about permission, not to speak on a show, not to grandstand, only to answer a letter with a letter. And the officer who had learned to recognize a decent instinct when it walked into his day said, "There is a way to do that kindly. We will make sure you do not harm with hands that finally want to help." In kitchens across the city, people adjusted the dial on their radios and found that the voice had chosen not to sensationalize the terms. It read them with the same tone it used when it told us about the worn spring and the sticker with its tongue out, and the smell of gasoline wrapped in talc, which is to say it honored the dignity of details, even when the detail was a number that mapped to months that mapped to years. The prosecutor went home to a small apartment where a plant had survived her neglect out of sheer stubbornness, and set down a bag she had not realized she was carrying in her own bone. And she stood at the window and watched a man drag a hose across a sidewalk and rinse away the city in patches until the concrete looked new for a minute. And she thought of how cases do not end when files close. They end when a place learns how to carry them without turning them into banners. And she made tea and did nothing clever and felt more useful than she had all week. The public defender did what the good ones do when the cameras roll on. He went back to clients whose names will never trend and argued for their ordinary mercies. And when a colleague asked how it felt to shepherd a case that had learned to live above the fold, he said it felt like standing in a doorway and letting two rooms see each other without pretending they are the same room. And then he shrugged because metaphors are a luxury when deadlines speed toward you like buses on a wet hill. The mother woke to a quieter house and at first mistook the quiet for absence until she recognized it as a different kind of presence, not an ache demanding a sound, an ache that could sit without pleading, and she let the candle remain unlit and opened the kitchen window wide enough to invite the morning in and not wide enough to invite the past to jump back onto the table. And she brewed coffee and set 2 cups out and then put one away, not in grief, in respect for a habit that had earned retirement. The mural gathered a small congregation without prompting. People stood and did not take selfies. They looked. They read the 3 words at the bottom and tried the plural in their mouths like a sacrament. We keep listening, and the phrase did not feel like performance. It felt like daily bread. And a woman in scrubs on her way to a night shift touched the painted hem of the red dress with the back of her fingers, the way you touch a baby's cheek to make sure you are not too rough. And then she went on without telling the internet she had done it. The guitarist took his song to a studio that smelled like memory foam and ambition and recorded it in one take because it was not a song designed for perfection, it was designed to be present. And the producer suggested a guest vocal, and the guitarist shook his head and said, "It already has one, the city." And the producer rolled his eyes and kept the mics open anyway, and on playback you could hear the faintest scuff of a shoe, the ceiling fan that made Dee sit slightly flat, the breath between climbs, the honest noise of a room that does not pretend to be a cathedral and still earns reverence. The anonymous voice did something brave and small at once. It published a bibliography. Not a self-congratulation, a ledger of thanks and sources, a list of street corners and first names and shop receipts, and a footnote explaining how a die signature outlasts myth when it clings to a gasket. And the list read like a poem made of inventory. And the city, not used to seeing a show hand away the illusion of magic, felt gratitude that landed like a clean glass on a bar. In the quieter orbit of the investigation, technicians finished the last slow sifts, the kind that would never trend because they have no dramatic silhouette, filtering mud for fragments, logging fibers that would never speak louder than a whisper. And in that attention, the case completed its transformation from meteor to sediment, from streak of light to layer in the ground you can touch and say, this is where that summer lives now. A schoolteacher used the story to build a lesson without exploitation. She asked her class to map the city not with landmarks but with acts of attention, the kiosk under a bed full of saved machines, the janitor's cloth, the mechanic's Polaroids, the cashier's decision to tell only what she saw, the dispatcher's crack on the word later, the analyst's patience with breath more than words, and the kids drew a Rio that looked less like a postcard and more like a nervous system. And the teacher sent a photo of the maps to the podcast inbox, and the voice did not air it. It wrote back a single sentence. "Thank you for teaching architecture." Joao wrote his letter. It did not ask to be absolved, and it did not offer to trade more truth for a lighter verdict. It told the shape of a night again because repetition is one of the ways the body believes, and then it told the shape of the days after, the daily cowardice of choosing later, later for the dent, later for the truth, later for the visit to a station whose fluorescent lights he feared more than any storm. And he wrote that later is a thief, and that he had let it live in his house. And he wrote that he had heard the word solved spoken like a conclusion and like a curse, and that he preferred the way the city had started to use it, not as a victory, as a duty. And he thanked the mother for keeping a chair at a table he had defiled, and he did not ask her to forgive. He asked her to keep living in a way he could not interrupt again. And the officer screened the letter and showed it to the investigator with the story about the brother, and then set it in a folder marked with a color no one had used in this case before, a soft green, the shade of leaves after a storm. The rumor mill, starving and bored by restraint, tried to reanimate the question of the voice. And a slick article offered guesses dressed as revelations, a familiar trick, and named a journalist, then a cop, then a neighbor, and each name came with a grainy photo and a paragraph of coy denials, and the voice answered by turning the camera toward the audience, inviting listeners to record themselves reading 3 lines about why they kept listening, and the feed filled with accents and pauses and stumbles and small home noises. Children in the background, pans on a stove, traffic, birds, and the collage felt like a better portrait of authorship than any single face, an admission that a city is the only author a case like this can survive. The prosecutor composed her victim impact presentation with a discipline that would look cold to anyone who did not understand its purpose. She removed adjectives the way a surgeon removes tissue that will not heal, leaving behind sentences with clean edges that could not be tugged into theatrics, and she delivered it in a courtroom that smelled like paper and old rain, with her voice pitched to reach the back row where people who do not usually get good seats listen for what they will take home to their kitchens. And when she finished, the judge thanked her without saying why, and the city understood anyway. The defender asked for mercy in a language that refused to blur the edges of harm, and he did not compare griefs or weigh them like butcher cuts. He asked that consequence be chosen to enlarge dignity rather than crush it, and he suggested work that acknowledged the night rather than hiding it, and he named places in the city where the work would be hard and visible and honest, and the judge wrote and underlined and looked out over the room and said, "What rooms like this are built to hear? That justice is not a feeling and mercy is not a mood, and that our task today is to secure gravity, not drama." Outside, the mural gathered a new layer of lives. People taped small squares of paper to the wall along the edge, not notes, just addresses of other corners where they had lost something and found a way to keep walking, and the squares fluttered for a day, and then the humidity melted the tape, and the papers drifted down, and the street cleaners swept them into tidy piles. And for a moment it felt like erasure, until someone pointed out that the addresses were now in the same place, the city's bin, which is to say the city's stomach, and that the story had been digested and would feed the next attention we needed to pay. The anonymous voice finally went quiet for a week and did not explain itself and did not tease a return, and while it was gone, the city discovered it could keep the new habits without a metronome. It could let microphones rest. It could allow the ocean to be a sound and not a suspect. It could set 2 coasters at the corner of a bar, out of courtesy and not as a spell. It could walk past the low wall without narrating it to itself and still feel the proper weight underfoot. When the voice returned, it did not stunt. It did not enlarge its own myth. It played the guitarist's recording, and over the bridge it laid a list of names again, not the same names and not new ones for novelty. Names of people whose jobs do not attract applause, who had done their work well. A technician who unjammed a copier that might have eaten a crucial page. A clerk who noticed 2 dates fighting on a form and corrected them. A driver who took a woman to the courthouse and waited without charging because he could tell she needed to leave fast when she came back out. A teacher who assigned a map made of attention, and the voice ended by saying the word solved again, twice, once like a file stamp, flat, once like a room taking a breath, low and full, and then the episode closed with the sound of a kettle settling, not whistling anymore, only the little hisses a metal makes when it remembers heat and lets it go. In a kitchen, a mother wiped a ring of coffee from the table and left it visible for a minute before a clean cloth erased it, a small ceremony for stains and their opposite. In a room with a heavy door, a man held a green folder and knew the color had changed a weather he had lived in for too long. On a beach, a gull ignored a saint and announced a fish to anyone who would listen, and no one took offense. The city did what cities do when a headline finally stops vibrating like an alarm. It folded the story into its rhythms and kept watching the corner without guarding it, which is another way of saying it learned to trust itself again, a little, enough to carry the next thing that will try to make it forget how. They called the first week of Consequence the season of plain clothes because nothing about it asked to be looked at and everything about it wanted to be done right. And the city, which had been training for months to accept this slower kind of weather, watched without circling the scene, letting the work breathe. Joao woke before the light and stood in a corridor that smelled like mop water and metal, and he signed his name where the clerk pointed and listened without interrupting, while an officer explained how the hours would be measured and how the places had been chosen. A rotation that would put his hands on the stubborn edges of the same city he had once driven through as if it were a machine. And when they handed him a vest with reflective stripes, he held it the way you hold something that might fit and might reject you, and he nodded when told the first sight was the low wall by the ditch. And he did not ask to change it because permission has a shape and he was learning to recognize it. The morning air was clean in that aggressive way it is after rain, every smell louder, diesel, wet concrete, sea, and he walked to the corner with two men who had been on crews like this before and who greeted him like a coworker and not like a headline. And that small mercy steadied his hands more than any speech could have, and the tape was gone now, the cones gone, only a thin, worn line on the ground where feet had paused and stepped around the mark for weeks, and a supervisor pointed to a list on a clipboard and said quietly that the job was simple: drain clearing, curb sweep, debris pickup, a loop, repeat. And he showed how the grate chokes itself with leaves and plastic, and how you loosen what looks solid with a hook until the water decides to move. João knelt and felt the city under his palms the way a mechanic feels a car, a known weight and a known resistance, and he pulled and lifted and stacked and learned how to keep his back from folding, and a bus sighed past, and a woman at the window watched with a face that could have been anger or could have been the neutral of a person holding a judgment in her mouth until it softens, and he kept his eyes down and let the loop teach him the hour. The anonymous voice waited 2 days before it spoke again, and when it did not frame this as redemption. It refused the lazy arc. It said the city is in maintenance now, which is a better word than closure because it implies attention over time, and it placed a microphone near a curb and recorded the sound of water relearning how to move, a patient gurgle that would bore anyone who had demanded fireworks and that soothed those who had accepted that gravity is the star of this show. And then the voice told us something small, that the supervisor on the crew did not say the driver's name aloud. He said, "Man, hand me the hook," and later he said, "Brother, watch your back." And the voice let those names sit because sometimes the best gift a city can give someone who has been a symbol is to call him by a word so ordinary it disappears. The prosecutor went to work in shoes that had walked too many corridors and considered for the first time in months not bringing a bag home full of files because the case had reached a shelf inside her that did not require carrying, and she opened a message from a colleague in another state, asking for the dye signature paper and the cadence notes and the DVR rescue method, and she wrote back with attachments and a note that said, "You will need a technician with patience and a community with stamina." And she closed her laptop and looked out at a strip of ocean that managed to look innocent even when it was lying, and she allowed herself to stand without planning the next 4 hours, a new skill learned late and welcome. The public defender taught a clinic for interns that week, and rather than telling them war stories, he showed them the skeleton of this case, the parts that had seemed glamorous when the headlines were loud and the parts that had done the real lifting when the lights cooled. And he said the duty is to keep the room honest, even when your client is the reason the room is full. And he wrote on the board a word they did not expect: stewardship. And he told them it is not just for forests and artworks, it is for harm too. And if that sounds pious, then go watch A City Forget, and you will come back to stewardship like it is oxygen. The mother tested a day without the old ritual and found that nothing dramatic happened when the candle remained unlit, that the kitchen still held the right weight, that the radio could be on for music and not for vigilance, that sorrow can sit in a chair and not pace a hallway. And she took the dress she had stored in tissue, not the red one, the blue one from a different year, and aired it at the window, not as an altar, as an act of housekeeping. And a neighbor across the courtyard saw and lifted a hand, and she lifted a hand back, and neither of them performed it for the moment's capture, and the relief of that privacy made the day bearable. The mural collected new offerings that did not look like offerings at first: a small rubber band someone wrapped around a drawn wrist, as if to keep a sleeve from slipping into dishwater, a paperclip shaped like a star pressed over the radio speaker, a sticker of a bus mascot with its tongue out tucked into a corner where rain would not get it, and the city did not police the shrine because it was not a shrine, it was a wall, and yet it worked. It drew a line between spectacle and witness, and invited people to stand on the better side. A school opened a seminar for parents called Appetite and Attention and invited the analyst and the technician to speak not as celebrities but as residents, and they brought their quiet objects, the cadence notebook, the tool that coaxed the DVR into coughing up a frame, the swatch book with its gluey spine, and the room was full of the kind of people who never go to panels: bus drivers on their day off, a woman who cleans hospital rooms, a baker who closes at noon and sleeps in the afternoon. And the analyst spoke in that careful voice that had made jurors once lean in, about how listening for breath can teach you more than listening for words. And the technician passed the little recorder around and explained how patience is a tool that leaves no fingerprints, but without it there would be nothing to hold. João finished his week at the ditch and moved on to a bus depot where oil and water make rude rainbows on the ground, and learned the run that keeps a fleet honest, the parts that like to fail, the screws that prefer to loosen themselves like bad habits, and the way to tighten them without stripping the head. And an older mechanic who had been there the year the bus flank wore a yellow bruise took him aside and did not talk about the case. He talked about torque and leverage and how a stubborn fitting gives if you treat it like a person, not like an enemy. and he offered half a sandwich without ceremony, and the two men stood under a humming light and ate the kind of food you only like at work. And if a camera had captured it, the image would have been misused, so it is good that no camera did. The anonymous voice did a field episode that refused to name sites directly and instead stitched a map out of sound, a broom on concrete, a grate clearing, a bus hinge moving correctly after a squeal, the polite shush of a courthouse hallway, a guitar string being tuned carefully to fight humidity, and over that collage the voice spoke about practice, the way a city teaches itself new reflexes, resisting the urge to run toward the loudest thing, learning instead to move toward what needs help. And it asked people to name the small jobs they had done that week that no one would thank them for, and messages filled the feed, changing a printer toner before a line formed, walking a neighbor's trash to the curb without a note, washing a stairwell handrail, filling out a form correctly on the first pass without needing a clerk to fix it. And none of this would trend, and all of it would hold the place together. A paper finally ran a profile of the voice that was in fact not a profile at all, but a meditation on the ethics of anonymity, and it quoted theologians and radio historians and a pop star who had once disguised her voice for a remix, and it asked whether a city can be the author of a narrative, and whether that is better for the living than any single signature, and the piece was generous and irritating in equal measure, and the voice did not respond to it because it had already given its bibliography and because answering would feed the old appetite. And the city, astonishingly, allowed the question to drift without handing it a knife. The prosecutor helped a junior attorney prepare a motion for a case that looked nothing like this one, except that it needed the same discipline. And at the end of the day, she walked to the chapel where the saint attracts gulls, and she sat for a minute and did not pray. She did inventory. She counted the people who had done the unphotogenic work, the janitor with the cloth, the mechanic with the drawer of Polaroids, the dispatcher whose voice cracked on later, the cashier who decided to speak only what she had seen, the teacher with her map, the technician with his patience, the analyst with her breath. And she felt a steadiness move up her spine that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with belonging. A rumor tried to turn the letter Joao had written into spectacle and failed because the officer who screened the mail, and the mother who received it, and the lawyer who had shepherded it, agreed that the season of display had ended, and that quiet is a right you earn by doing your part of the work. And in a week when the city had the energy to be cruel, it chose not to be, which is not a small victory. The guitarist got a call from a radio show and declined because he wanted the song to live in rooms and not as a ringtone, and he played at the bar on a night when the ceiling fan was off and the notes stayed where he put them, and he hit the final climb and held the landing and set the pick down like a man setting down a tool, and the bartender set 2 coasters at the corner out of habit and did not look at them as talismans, only as courtesy. And 2 customers sat there an hour later and talked about something that had nothing to do with the case. And that was not disrespect. It was the city trusting its new balance. In the depot, Joao learned to change out a light that flickers only when a bus leans into a curve, the sort of problem that hides from inspection and only shows itself to drivers and night workers. And he replaced the fitting and cleaned the lens and watched the beam settle into what it should be. And that small click of resolution felt honest in a way that all the words of the past months had not. And he slept that night without counting buses or listing tools or hearing the word later knocking at his skull. The anonymous voice closed the week with a short maid of room tones again, a corridor hum, a kettle settling, the sound of a page turned gently, the slow gurgle of a drain, and it said one thing only, that solved is not an event but a maintenance plan. And the city, which had been looking for fireworks for too long and had learned to appreciate wiring diagrams, nodded in kitchens and on buses and in workshops and in the courthouse lobby where the vending machine still eats coins on Fridays, and then the short ended with silence that did not feel like absence and did not feel like suspense. It felt like a hand being taken off a shoulder because the person had learned to balance. Night came in clean and ordinary. The low wall kept its dignity. The ditch did what ditches do. The buses breathed. The ocean pretended innocence with such conviction you could almost forgive it. In a kitchen, a mother folded the dish towel she had used to wipe soot weeks earlier and placed it in the drawer and chose a fresh one for tomorrow. And in a room under an indifferent light, a man set an alarm for a morning shift that would ask his back to do honest work. And he accepted the ask and closed his eyes. And somewhere in the city, a child fell asleep to a radio that was finally playing songs without someone whispering over them. And that, more than any headline, felt like the correct shape of progress.